The letter fluttered to the floor as Harold Blackwood's face contorted with disgust. "This isn't what I paid for," he spat, stepping back as if the woman before him carried something contagious. Elizabeth Morrison stood motionless, her traveling bag still clutched in her trembling hand. The journey's exhaustion etched across her pale features. She'd traveled over 500 miles to marry a man who now looked at her like she was damaged goods. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Your advertisement said nothing about a cripple, Harold continued, addressing the stagecoach driver who delivered her as if Elizabeth weren't even present. "I requested a capable wife, someone who could work the land alongside me." Elizabeth's throat tightened. The familiar shame burned beneath her skin, but she kept her chin raised, refusing to crumble before this stranger. "I can work, Mr. Blackwood. My leg doesn't prevent me from—" "I don't need explanations," he cut her off. "I need a real wife, not a burden." He turned away, grabbing his hat from the hook by the door. "Driver, take her back. This arrangement is terminated." As the stagecoach rolled away from Harold Blackwood's farm, leaving behind her dreams of a new beginning, Elizabeth pressed her forehead against the cold glass of the window. Rain began to fall, matching the tears she refused to shed. She had nowhere to go, no money to return to Boston, and winter was approaching in this unfamiliar Pennsylvania town. Little did she know that in Pinewood Creek, a doctor with his own broken pieces would soon cross her path, a man who understood that our deepest wounds often hold our greatest strength. Pinewood Creek appeared through the rain-streaked window like a watercolor painting, smudged edges of buildings, the occasional lamplight glowing amber against the gathering dusk. Elizabeth Morrison counted the coins in her purse for the third time, $3.42. Not enough for a return ticket to Boston, not nearly enough to survive a Pennsylvania winter. The stagecoach lurched to a halt in the town square. The driver, who'd maintained an uncomfortable silence since they'd departed the Blackwood farm, cleared his throat. "End of the line, miss." "But I was told," Elizabeth began, her voice barely audible above the drumming rain. "Mr. Blackwood paid for delivery, not return passage." The man's eyes softened momentarily. "I'm sorry. That's all I can do." The rain soaked through Elizabeth's woolen coat as she stood in the middle of the square, her carpet bag growing heavier. By the minute, her left leg, permanently weakened from childhood polio, ached fiercely from the day's journey. She had known this was a risk, spending nearly all her savings on a one-way ticket, trusting the letters from a stranger who promised marriage and security. The letters that had described her as agreeable and educated, carefully omitting any mention of her limp. A gust of wind nearly knocked her off balance. Elizabeth steadied herself against a hitching post, scanning the unfamiliar buildings. The town was small. A church, several shops, a modest hotel that surely charged more per night than she could afford. A sign swung violently in the wind. Wilson's General Store. Light spilled from its windows, promising at least temporary shelter. The bell above the door announced her entrance. A woman looked up from behind the counter, her grey hair pulled into a severe bun, her eyes narrowing as she assessed the dripping stranger. Several other patrons turned to stare. "Sorry for the mess," Elizabeth murmured, trying to contain the growing puddle beneath her feet. She made an effort to normalize her gait as she moved further into the store, but fatigue made her limp more. "Impronounced. You're not from around here," the woman stated flatly, not a question. "No, ma'am. I've just arrived from Boston." A man by the pickle barrel snorted. Another one of Blackwood's mail orders. Heat rose to Elizabeth's cheeks. Yes." The silence that followed told her everything. This had happened before. The woman behind the counter sighed, setting down her ledger. "I'm Martha Wilson. This is my store." She gestured to a small stool. "Sit before you fall over." Elizabeth gratefully accepted, trying to ignore the curious stares. Is there somewhere in town I might find lodging? Something modest. Martha exchanged glances with the other customers. Blackwood sent you back, didn't he? What was his excuse this time? The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Elizabeth's fingers instinctively moved to her left leg, then stopped. She lifted her chin. Mr. Blackwood found me unsuitable. Because of your leg, Martha clarified, her directness startling. Elizabeth nodded once, her jaw tight. Martha made a sound of disgust. That man has rejected 3 brides this year. Alone, always finding some flaw. Too tall, too educated, too outspoken. She shook her head. He keeps the dowry money each time. I didn't bring a dowry, Elizabeth said quietly. Just myself. Small blessing, then. Martha leaned against the counter, studying Elizabeth more carefully. What's your name, girl? Elizabeth Morrison, though most call me Eliza. And what were you before you decided to marry a stranger in the middle of nowhere? The question caught her off guard. Before her father died of consumption. Before her mother followed 6 months later. Before the family home was sold to pay debts, leaving her with few options as a woman with a disability. I was my father's assistant. He was a professor of literature at Boston College. She hesitated. I also helped our housekeeper with herbal remedies. I have some skill with treating common ailments. Martha nodded thoughtfully. Can you read? Write? Keep accounts? Yes, ma'am. Quite well. And you came all this way to marry Harold Blackwood. Martha's tone suggested this was perhaps the least intelligent of Elizabeth's accomplishments. A few chuckles sounded around the store. Elizabeth's exhaustion suddenly gave way to a flash of anger. I came all this way to build a life, Mrs. Wilson. I have nothing left in Boston. No family, no prospects. She gestured to her leg. Few men in Boston were interested in a wife who limps, regardless of what else she might offer. Mr. Blackwood's letters suggested he valued companionship and intelligence. She looked down. Clearly, his letters were misleading. Martha exchanged glances with an older man near the stove. Some unspoken communication passed between them. The boarding house is full with railroad workers, Martha finally said. But I have a room above the store. It's small, nothing fancy. You can stay there tonight while we figure something out. Elizabeth blinked back sudden tears. I can't accept charity. It's not charity. It's common decency. Martha's tone brooked no argument. Besides, you said you're good with numbers. My eyes aren't what they used to be, and these ledgers need updating. Before Elizabeth could respond, the door flew open. Wind and rain gusted in, along with a man in a sodden coat. He removed his hat, revealing dark hair streaked with premature gray at the temples. Evening, Dr. Walker, Martha called. Didn't expect to see you out in this weather. The doctor nodded, his eyes briefly meeting Elizabeth's before looking away. She noticed how he kept his right hand tucked inside his coat. Mrs. Miller's time came early. Baby boy, healthy despite the rush. His voice was deep but quiet, as if he were accustomed to speaking in sick rooms. That's the 3rd Miller boy, isn't it? Martha began gathering supplies. I'll send over some of that willow bark tea for her after pains. Much appreciated. His gaze returned to Elizabeth, a flicker of professional assessment in his eyes. New in town? Before she could answer, one of the men by the stove called, out to Blackwood's latest bride, sent back for being damaged goods. Elizabeth flinched. Dr. Walker's expression darkened. Jacob, Martha snapped. That's enough. Dr. Walker approached slowly, and Elizabeth noticed a slight unevenness in his gait, different from her own, but noticeable nonetheless. He stopped a respectful distance away. Thomas Walker, he introduced himself. Town doctor, such as I am. "Elizabeth Morrison," she replied, fighting the urge to hide her hands in her skirts to make herself smaller. He nodded, then turned to Martha. "I need supplies for the clinic, bandages, iodine, whatever carbolic acid you have left." As Martha began gathering his order, thunder cracked overhead. The lamps flickered, and Elizabeth thought of the small room Martha had offered, a sanctuary from this storm, from this day's humiliations, from the crushing weight of having gambled everything on a promise that had evaporated the moment Harold Blackwood saw her limp down from the stagecoach. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Dr. Walker settled his bill with his left hand, his right remaining hidden. As he gathered his purchases, he glanced again at Elizabeth. "Pinewood Creek isn't always welcoming to newcomers," he said quietly. "But it's not always as cruel as today, as likely seemed." He nodded a goodbye and disappeared back into the storm. Later, in the narrow room above the store, Elizabeth sat on the edge of a thin mattress. Her wet clothes hung to dry on a makeshift line Martha had helped her string across the rafters. The older woman had brought up a tray with bread, cheese, and tea before retiring to her own quarters at the back of the store. Elizabeth wrapped her fingers around the warm cup, letting the heat seep into her bones. Through the small window, Pinewood Creek was dark, except for scattered lamplight. Somewhere out there was Harold Blackwood's farm, where in a different version of today, she might have been settling in as a new bride. The thought no longer brought sadness, only a dull anger. She opened her carpet bag, removing the carefully packed items of her former life. 3 dresses, a hairbrush that had been her mother's, a small box of herbal preparations, her father's copy of Wordsworth's poems, and a sealed envelope containing her parents' marriage certificate and her own birth records. The documentation of a life now left behind. At the bottom of the bag lay Harold Blackwood's letters. She should burn them, she thought. Instead, she reread them by lamplight, searching for the clues she'd missed, the warnings she'd ignored. "I seek a companion in my advancing years," he'd written. "Someone of good character and practical mind. Your education would bring refinement to my home, and I offer security and respect in return." So many words, and yet the only ones that mattered had remained unwritten. "I expect physical perfection. I will reject what doesn't meet my standard." Elizabeth blew out the lamp and lay back on the unfamiliar bed. Rain continued to drum against the roof. Tomorrow would require decisions, plans, but tonight she allowed herself to feel the full force of her situation. Stranded, nearly penniless, in a town where she knew no one, her future as uncertain as the storm-darkened sky. What Elizabeth couldn't have known, as sleep finally claimed her, was that Thomas Walker lay awake in his own quarters beside the clinic, his damaged hand throbbing with the changing weather, thinking of the proud, wounded expression on the face of Pinewood Creek's newest, unwanted arrival. Morning arrived with watery sunshine and the sound of commerce beginning below. Elizabeth dressed carefully in her second-best dress, arranging her hair in a simple but neat style. If she was to find employment in Pinewood Creek, she needed to appear capable, not desperate, regardless of how she felt. Martha was already behind the counter when Elizabeth descended, a ledger open before her. "Coffee's hot on the stove," she said by way of greeting. "Help yourself." "Thank you for the room," Elizabeth said. "I can pay. We'll settle accounts later." Martha pushed the ledger toward her. "If you're serious about being good with numbers, I could use help with these. The columns haven't balanced in months." It was work, not charity. Elizabeth felt a small measure of tension leave her shoulders. "I'd be happy to help." For the next hour, she worked steadily through the accounts, finding small errors, reorganizing entries. The familiar rhythm of arithmetic was soothing, a reminder that some things remained constant, no matter where one found oneself. Occasionally, customers entered, each eyeing her with varying degrees of curiosity. "The new doctor in town?" One woman asked Martha, loud enough for Elizabeth to hear. "Just passing through," Martha replied, not bothering to correct the assumption. Just after 10 o'clock, the bell chimed again. Elizabeth looked up to see Dr. Walker, his medical bag in his left hand. Today, she could see his right hand clearly, the fingers curled inward slightly, the wrist stiff. A war injury, she guessed, remembering what Martha had called him. The doctor who came back changed. He nodded to them both. "Mrs. Wilson, Miss Morrison, I trust you found accommodation." "Mrs. Wilson has been kind enough to offer temporary lodging," Elizabeth replied, conscious of the way his gaze seemed to take in everything, her posture, the ledger before her, the carefully controlled way she shifted her weight to ease, pressure on her weakened leg. "Eliza's been fixing my account books," Martha interjected. "Girl has a head for numbers." Dr. Walker seemed about to respond when the door burst open again. A boy of about 12, face flushed with exertion, stumbled in. "Doc, come quick! It's Grandma Jenkins. She's having one of her spells, and Pa says it's worse than before." Thomas nodded calmly. "I'll come right away, Tim." He turned back to Elizabeth. "It seems Pinewood Creek has a way of keeping newcomers busy. Perhaps I'll see you again, Miss Morrison." After he departed, Elizabeth returned to the ledgers, but her mind kept drifting. She couldn't stay in Martha's spare room indefinitely. She needed proper employment, a place of her own. The $3.42 wouldn't last long. "Does Dr. Walker have much help? At his clinic, I mean," she asked, trying to sound casual. Martha glanced up from measuring fabric for a customer. "He manages alone mostly. Sometimes the Reverend's wife assists with female patients." She finished cutting the fabric. "Why do you ask?" Elizabeth hesitated. "I mentioned I helped with herbal remedies in Boston. I'm not trained as a nurse, but I know basic care, how to dress wounds, brew fever tonics, that sort of thing." "Thomas Walker is particular about his clinic," Martha said carefully. "Since the war, well, he keeps to himself. Doesn't easily accept help." "I see." Elizabeth returned to the ledgers, disappointment settling in her stomach. "That's not to say he couldn't use assistance," Martha added after a moment. "Man works himself half to death, especially since his hand got damaged. Can barely write prescriptions some days, though he'd never admit it." The morning passed into afternoon. Elizabeth completed the account reconciliation, feeling a small sense of accomplishment when the columns finally balanced. Martha examined her work with approval. "You've earned your keep for a few days at least," she declared. "Now let's talk about something more permanent." Before she could continue, the store door opened again. A woman entered, her expression pinched, eyes red-rimmed. She nodded curtly to Martha before addressing Elizabeth directly. "You're the mail-order bride Harry Blackwood rejected?" Elizabeth stiffened. "I am Elizabeth Morrison, yes." The woman's gaze traveled obviously to Elizabeth's leg. "I'm Ruth Blackwood, Harry's sister," she sniffed. "I've come to offer you passage back to Boston." Martha made a sound of disapproval, but Ruth continued. "My brother was wrong to bring you all this way without being clear about his expectations. I've convinced him to cover your return fare." The offer hung in the air. Return to Boston. To what? Empty lodgings, dwindling opportunities, the pitying glances of former acquaintances who had watched her family's decline. "That's considerate," Elizabeth said carefully. "But I believe I'll stay in Pinewood Creek." Ruth's eyebrows rose. "There's nothing for you here." "Perhaps not yet," Elizabeth replied, surprised by the steadiness in her voice. "But there was nothing for me in Boston either. At least here I haven't yet proven that to be true." After Ruth departed, Martha gave a short laugh. "You've got spine, I'll say that for you." She hesitated, then added, "Dr. Walker lost his wife in childbirth during the war. He was serving as an army surgeon when it happened. Couldn't save her from a distance." She began rearranging items on a shelf. "He came back changed. The hand, yes, but more than that. Keeps to that clinic like it's both punishment and salvation." Elizabeth absorbed this information silently, understanding. Martha was offering more than gossip. She was providing context, a map to navigate this small town's complex terrain. "The building next to the clinic has a small apartment above it," Martha continued. "Owner's been trying to rent it for months. It's not much, but it's clean. Might suit someone looking to start fresh." Elizabeth felt a flutter of possibility. "I'll inquire about it, thank you." That evening, after the store closed, Elizabeth walked slowly through Pinewood Creek. Her leg ached from standing most of the day, but she ignored it, focusing instead on the town that might become her home. She passed the church, the small schoolhouse, a tavern from which raucous laughter spilled. Finally, she came to the clinic, a modest building with Dr. T. Walker, physician, painted on a weathered sign. Light glowed from one window. Through it, she glimpsed Dr. Walker bent over his desk, his damaged right hand supported by his left, as he laboriously wrote in what appeared to be a patient ledger. His face was drawn with concentration and what might have been pain. Elizabeth stepped back, suddenly feeling like an intruder. As she turned to leave, her weak leg buckled slightly, causing her to stumble against a rain barrel with a dull thud. The clinic door opened moments later. Dr. Walker peered out, lantern held high. "Miss Morrison?" She straightened, embarrassed. "I apologize for disturbing you. I was just exploring the town." He studied her for a moment. "Would you like to come in? It's getting cold." The clinic was meticulously organized, despite its modest furnishings. Glass bottles of medications lined wooden shelves, instruments were arranged precisely on trays, and a series of anatomical drawings were pinned to one wall. A curtained area presumably concealed an examination table. "You keep a well-ordered practice," Elizabeth observed. "Necessity rather than virtue," he replied. "In surgery, especially field surgery, organization can mean the difference between life and death." He set the lantern down, and she noticed him flexing his right hand, the fingers resisting full extension. Without thinking, she reached into her pocket and withdrew a small tin. "This might help," she offered. "It's a salve of arnica and wintergreen. Good for joint pain, especially when the weather changes." Dr. Walker looked at the tin, then at her, surprise evident in his features. "You're familiar with herbal medicine?" "Only practically, not formally," she clarified quickly. "Our housekeeper in Boston was knowledgeable about traditional remedies. I helped prepare them." He accepted the tin cautiously. "Thank you." An awkward silence fell. Elizabeth glanced at the ledger on his desk. Pages of patient notes written in an increasingly strained hand, the letters becoming less controlled as they progressed across the page. "Mrs. Wilson mentioned you manage the clinic alone," she said finally. "By choice," he replied, his tone suggesting the subject was closed. Elizabeth nodded, understanding the conversation had reached its limit. "I should go. Thank you for allowing me in." At the door, she paused. "Dr. Walker, the apartment above the neighboring building. Do you know if it's still available?" Something flickered across his face. Surprise, perhaps concern. "It is, but it's basic accommodation, Miss Morrison. The stairs are steep." "I'm familiar with navigating difficulties," she said simply. He studied her for a long moment. "Yes," he finally said. "I imagine you are." Walking back to Martha's store, Elizabeth felt the weight of the day pressing down on her. She had arrived in Pinewood Creek less than 24 hours ago, rejected and abandoned, Now she was contemplating staying, putting down roots in soil that had already proven inhospitable. Yet something kept her from accepting Ruth Blackwood's offer of return passage. Pride, perhaps, or simple, stubborn determination not to be defeated by Harold Blackwood's cruelty. Or maybe it was the memory of Dr. Walker's face as he struggled with his ledger, a man whose broken pieces didn't prevent him from building something meaningful in this small town. Her leg ached fiercely by the time she reached Martha's store. The older woman took one look at her and pointed firmly to a chair. "Sit, I'll make tea." Elizabeth sank gratefully into the seat, extending her left leg cautiously. "I went to see the apartment." Martha raised an eyebrow. "And? I'd like to rent it, if I can find employment to cover the cost." Martha set the kettle on the stove. "The school needs someone to teach the younger children. Previous teacher left to get married last spring. They've been making do with the Reverend's wife, but she's expecting and won't continue past Christmas." Elizabeth felt a spark of hope. "I could teach. I help my father with his students often. Pays modest but steady. When could I apply?" Martha smiled for the first time since Elizabeth had met her. "You already did. I'm on the school board." Elizabeth stared at her. "You planned this." "Let's say I recognized an opportunity." Martha poured the tea. "This town needs new blood, fresh thinking. People who understand that suffering doesn't make you less capable, sometimes quite the opposite." Elizabeth wrapped her fingers around the warm cup, thinking of Dr. Walker's damaged hand, of her own imperfect leg, of Harold Blackwood's rejection, that had unwittingly delivered her not to defeat, but to possibility. "Thank you," she said simply. "Don't thank me yet," Martha replied. "Wait until you've met the children." That night, lying again in the narrow bed above the store, Elizabeth felt something she hadn't expected to find in Pinewood Creek, a fragile tendril of hope taking root. Tomorrow she would secure the apartment, inquire formally about the teaching position. She would write to her former landlady in Boston, asking her to ship the few books and personal items left behind. Outside, the wind had changed direction, carrying the promise of the first real cold of autumn. Winter would follow, harsh, challenging, unforgiving. But for the first time since stepping down from that stagecoach, Elizabeth Morrison allowed herself to believe she might find a way to weather it. Elizabeth awoke to frost patterns etched across the small window pane, delicate whirls of ice capturing the pale morning light. November had arrived with a vengeance overnight, the temperature plummeting to signal winter's approach. She dressed quickly, her fingers stiff with cold, layering her second shawl over her dress before descending to the store below. Martha was already stoking the pot-bellied stove, her breath visible in the chilly air. "Weather's turned," she remarked, glancing up as Elizabeth appeared. "We'll have snow before Thanksgiving, mark my words." "I should secure that apartment today," Elizabeth said, pouring herself a cup of the coffee Martha had already brewed. "Before the weather worsens." Martha nodded. "Smart thinking. Samuel Pierce owns the building. He'll be at the Mercantile until noon." She paused, regarding Elizabeth with shrewd eyes. "School board meets this afternoon at 4, if you're serious about the teaching position." "I am." Elizabeth sipped the strong coffee, allowing its warmth to spread through her chest. "Very serious." After breakfast, Elizabeth made her way carefully along Pinewood Creek's main street. The overnight frost had left the wooden boardwalks treacherous, and she moved with deliberate precision, mindful of her vulnerable leg. The last thing she needed was a fall that would only confirm the town's likely suspicion that she was indeed an invalid. The Mercantile was busier than Wilson's general store, with a broader inventory that spoke to Pinewood Creek's aspirations beyond a simple farming community. Samuel Pierce proved to be a rotund man with mutton chop whiskers and a businessman's calculating eye. He assessed Elizabeth as she explained her interest in the apartment. Above the milliner's shop. That's been vacant since June. His gaze flickered briefly to her leg. Stairs are steep, 22 of them. I can manage stairs, Mr. Pierce, Elizabeth replied evenly. I'd like to see it, if you have time. The apartment was indeed reached by a narrow, steep staircase that left Elizabeth winded by the top, though she was careful not to show it. The space itself was modest, but clean. A main room with a small cook stove, a bedroom hardly larger than a closet, and a window overlooking the back alley where deliveries were made to the businesses below. Privies shared with the shop, Samuel explained, opening a second door that revealed a smaller staircase leading down to the back of the building. Water pump in the alley, no well inside. Elizabeth nodded, already calculating the effort of navigating those stairs multiple times daily, carrying water, especially in winter, but the alternative, returning to Boston defeated or remaining dependent on Martha's charity, was unacceptable. The rent, $4 monthly in advance. More than she'd hoped, but not impossible if she secured the teaching position. I can pay 2 months now, she said, reaching for her diminishing purse. And the remainder when I receive my first wages from the school. Samuel's eyebrows rose. School, is it? You're to be our new teacher. The board meets this afternoon, Elizabeth replied, not adding that her appointment was far from certain. Samuel pocketed the money with a curt, "The keys are yours. Make sure both locks stay secured. Some of the railroad workers get rowdy after payday." Back on the street, Elizabeth felt the weight of her decision. She had just spent nearly 2/3 of her remaining money, gambling on a position she didn't yet formally hold. The cold air bit at her cheeks as she turned toward the clinic, her next self-appointed task even more daunting than securing lodging. The clinic door was unlocked, a small bell announcing her entrance. The front room was empty, but she heard movement from behind a partially closed door. Moments later, Thomas Walker appeared, looking surprised to find her there. "Miss Morrison, is everything all right?" She straightened her shoulders. "Quite well, thank you. I've come with a proposition." His expression shifted to wariness. "A proposition?" "I've taken the apartment above the milliner's shop. I'm applying for the teaching position at the school." He nodded slowly. Martha mentioned the possibility. The children would benefit from proper instruction. Teaching will provide basic income, but not enough. Elizabeth forced herself to continue before courage deserted her. "I understand you manage this clinic alone. I'm offering my assistance 3 afternoons weekly. I have experience with basic patient care, herbal preparations, and keeping records." Thomas's face closed like a book snapping shut. "I appreciate the offer, but I don't require assistance." Elizabeth glanced pointedly at the cluttered desk where several days' worth of patient records appeared to await transcription. "With respect, Dr. Walker, I believe you do." A muscle in his jaw tightened. "Miss Morrison, my father always said pride was the luxury of those with unlimited resources," she interrupted. "Neither of us is in that fortunate position." For a moment he simply stared at her, and Elizabeth feared she had overstepped disastrously. Then, unexpectedly, one corner of his mouth lifted slightly. "Your father sounds like a pragmatic man." "He was when necessity demanded it." Thomas ran his left hand through his hair, his right remaining partially curled at his side. "What do you know of medical practice beyond herbal remedies? I can read and write with clarity. I can maintain accurate records. I know basic wound dressing, how to recognize common illnesses, and when a situation requires more skilled intervention." She paused. I also know what it means to be treated as if a physical limitation defines your entire worth. The last words hung in the air between them. Thomas moved to the window, looking out at the street for several long moments before speaking again. 2 afternoons weekly initially, Wednesdays and Fridays after school hours, 50 cents per day paid, weekly. He turned back to her. A trial arrangement until Christmas, then we'll reassess. Relief washed through her, though she kept her expression composed. That's acceptable. When shall I begin? Tomorrow afternoon, if the school board approves your appointment today. He hesitated. If they don't, the offer of clinic work still stands. The unexpected kindness in those words, the acknowledgement that her plans might falter, and his willingness to provide a safety net regardless, caught Elizabeth off guard. "Thank you," she said simply. He nodded once, returning to his professional demeanor. "I should warn you, some patients may be reluctant to be treated by a woman, particularly one they view as—" He broke off, clearly uncomfortable. "Damaged," Elizabeth supplied, her voice steady. "I'm quite accustomed to overcoming such perceptions, Dr. Walker." "Thomas," he corrected quietly. "If we're to work together, you should use my given name." "Elizabeth," she offered in return, "though I prefer Eliza in less formal settings." Something passed between them then. Not quite understanding, not yet trust, but perhaps the recognition of shared experience. 2 people acquainted with the weight of others' judgments, with bodies that didn't always cooperate with their wishes. The school board meeting that afternoon was held in the church's small side room. 5 members seated at a rectangular table. Martha Wilson, Reverend George Collins, a thin man with spectacles perched on his nose, Mrs. Helen Collins, the Reverend's visibly pregnant wife, Mayor Frederick Thompson, whose substantial girth suggested prosperity, and Samuel Pierce, who nodded curtly to Elizabeth, their earlier business transaction apparently not meriting warmer acknowledgement. Elizabeth stood before them, hands clasped to hide their slight trembling as Martha made the introduction. "This is Elizabeth Morrison, recently arrived from Boston. She's the daughter of a college professor, educated well beyond what our school requires and experienced in teaching assistants. We understand you were initially brought to Pinewood Creek under different circumstances," Reverend Collins said delicately. Elizabeth met his gaze directly. "I came as a mail-order bride. Yes, the arrangement proved unsuitable for Mr. Blackwood." "Because of your disability," Mayor Thompson stated bluntly. "Frederick," Martha admonished, but Elizabeth raised a hand. "It's a fair observation, Mrs. Wilson. Yes, Mayor Thompson, Mr. Blackwood found my physical condition unacceptable. However, my leg doesn't impair my ability to teach. My mind is sound, my education excellent, and my patience with children well tested through years of assisting younger students in my father's classes." Helen Collins leaned forward. "The children range from 6 to 14 years. We've divided them somewhat by age, but with only one schoolroom, you'd be teaching multiple levels simultaneously." "I'm familiar with the approach," Elizabeth assured her. "My father often conducted classes with students of varying abilities." "The pay is $15 monthly," Samuel Pierce interjected, "for 6 days weekly, excluding Sundays. School hours 8 to 3, with additional preparation expected. The position includes the small room behind the schoolhouse for your personal use during the day, though it's not suitable for permanent lodging." "I've secured the apartment above the milliner's shop," Elizabeth replied. The board members exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. "There's the matter of permanence," Reverend Collins said carefully. "The previous teacher left us to marry. We'd prefer someone with stability." "I have no immediate marriage prospects, Reverend," Elizabeth said dryly, gesturing subtly toward her leg. "Nor am I likely to acquire any." Martha made a noise that might have been a suppressed laugh. Mayor Thompson frowned disapprovingly. "There's also the issue of community acceptance," he continued. "Some parents may object to, well, to their children being taught by a cripple." Elizabeth finished for him, the word deliberate, challenging. The mayor flushed. "To a teacher with your condition, yes. Then allow me to address that concern directly." Elizabeth straightened her shoulders. "My condition resulted from polio at age 5. It affected only my left leg, leaving it weaker and shorter than my right. It causes me no pain beyond occasional discomfort in cold weather. It does not impair my mental faculties, my ability to maintain discipline, or my capacity to inspire learning in young minds." She took a breath. "More importantly, it has taught me perseverance, adaptability, and compassion, qualities I believe essential in any good teacher." A silence followed her words. Helen Collins was the first to smile, a small gesture of approval. "I believe Miss Morrison would be an excellent influence on our children," she said, "particularly in demonstrating that limitations need not define one's capabilities." "I agree," Martha added firmly. The vote that followed was not unanimous, Mayor Thompson and Samuel Pierce expressing reservations, but the majority prevailed. Elizabeth Morrison was appointed temporary teacher of Pinewood Creek School, effective immediately, with permanent status to be determined after a 3-month probationary period. As Elizabeth walked back to Martha's store, the late afternoon, sun casting long shadows across the street, she allowed herself a moment of quiet triumph. In 2 days, she had secured lodging, employment, and the beginnings of a place in this community. It was more than she had dared hope for when she'd arrived, humiliated and desperate, on the verge of destitution. Tomorrow, she would move into her apartment, begin at the school, and start her work at the clinic. It would be challenging, physically demanding in ways that would test her endurance, and socially complex in a town still forming its opinion of her. But for the first time since her parents' deaths, Elizabeth felt something like solid ground beneath her feet. That evening, as she packed her meager belongings, Martha brought up a small wooden box. "Teaching supplies," she explained, setting it on the bed. "Chalk, slates, a primer, some paper. Not much, but it'll help you start." Elizabeth stared at the items, unexpected emotion tightening her throat. "This is very kind," Martha shrugged. "Town should provide these things, but the school budget's always tight. Consider it an investment in our children's future." "I won't disappoint you," Elizabeth promised. Martha regarded her with serious eyes. "I know you won't. That's why I pushed for your appointment." She hesitated. "Thomas also spoke favorably of you to the board." Elizabeth looked up in surprise. "Dr. Walker advocated for me. Sent a note this morning. Said you showed intelligence and determination worthy of the teaching position." "Oh, coming from Thomas, that's high praise. He doesn't involve himself in town matters often." The knowledge that Thomas Walker had supported her candidacy without obligation or expectation settled warmly in Elizabeth's chest. Perhaps she had found not just opportunity in Pinewood Creek, but an ally as well. The first snowflakes began to fall as Elizabeth made her way to the schoolhouse the following morning. The building was a simple clapboard structure with a small bell tower, recently painted white with green trim. Inside, rows of benches faced a larger desk at the front, a blackboard covering most of the wall behind it. A pot-bellied stove in the corner provided inadequate heat, the furthest corners of the room still carrying the previous night's chill. Elizabeth arrived early, wanting to familiarize herself with the space before the children arrived. She wrote her name neatly on the blackboard, Miss Morrison, and arranged the meager teaching supplies Martha had provided. The first students began arriving just before 8. their curious eyes taking in the new teacher with undisguised interest. By 8 o'clock, 23 children occupied the benches, ranging from a tiny girl with blonde braids who couldn't be more than 6, to a lanky boy at the back who appeared almost a man. "Good morning," Elizabeth began, her voice clear and confident despite the flutter of nerves in her stomach. "I am Miss Morrison, your new teacher." A small boy in the front row raised his hand immediately. "Why do you walk funny?" A ripple of nervous giggles swept through the room. Elizabeth had anticipated this question, had prepared for it, but still felt the familiar heat of embarrassment rise in her cheeks. "That's not a proper greeting, young man," she replied calmly. "In this classroom, we begin interactions with respect. Let's try again. Good morning, students." The children, somewhat abashed, responded in ragged unison. "Good morning, Miss Morrison. Better. Now to answer your question." She moved deliberately to the front of her desk, making no attempt to hide her uneven gait. "When I was a child, about 6 years old, I became very ill with a disease called polio. Many children who contract it don't survive. I was fortunate, but the illness weakened my left leg permanently." She looked at each child in turn. "In this classroom, we will learn that people's differences, whether physical, intellectual, or circumstantial, are simply parts of who they are, neither to be mocked nor ignored. Is that understood?" Solemn nods answered her. The small boy who had asked the question looked down at his slate. "Excellent. Now I'd like each of you to stand, state your name and age, and tell me one thing you enjoy learning about. We'll begin at the front." By mid-morning, Elizabeth had divided the children into 3 groups based on their abilities, setting independent work for 2 groups while she instructed the 3rd. The system worked reasonably well, though maintaining order required constant vigilance. Her leg began to ache from standing, but she ignored it, focusing instead on the bright eyes of a young girl sounding out her first complex word, on the look of comprehension dawning on a boy's face as arithmetic suddenly made sense. At noon, the children ate their packed lunches while Elizabeth retreated briefly to the small room behind the classroom. Little more than a closet with a desk and chair, but a welcome moment of quiet. She massaged her leg discreetly, dreading the afternoon session at the clinic that would follow a full day of teaching. Perhaps she had been too ambitious, taking on both positions immediately. The afternoon lessons dragged, her energy flagging, the children growing restless as the early winter darkness began to gather outside. When she finally dismissed them at 3 o'clock, Elizabeth sank into her chair, allowing herself 5 minutes of rest before gathering her belongings for the walk to the clinic. The snow had stopped, but the temperature had dropped further, the ground beginning to freeze beneath a thin white blanket. Elizabeth pulled her shawl tighter, gritting her teeth against the protests of her leg as she made her way slowly down the street. Thomas was with a patient when she arrived, so Elizabeth set about organizing the cluttered desk, sorting papers into neat piles, patient records in one stack, supply inventories in another, correspondence in a third. She had just begun transcribing the previous day's notes into the main ledger when the examination room door opened. An elderly man emerged, followed by Thomas, who looked momentarily surprised to see Elizabeth already at work. "Miss Morrison," he acknowledged with a nod. "Mr. Harding, this is my new assistant. She'll be helping with records and preparations." The old man squinted at Elizabeth. "You're that mail-order gal Blackwood sent packing." Elizabeth maintained her composure. "I am Elizabeth Morrison, yes. It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Harding." Heard you're teaching the youngsters now," he continued, seemingly oblivious to her discomfort. "And working here too? That leg of yours going to hold up?" Before Elizabeth could respond, Thomas stepped forward. "Miss Morrison's capabilities are not in question, Mr. Harding. She comes highly recommended and is already proving valuable. His tone, though polite, carried a note of finality. "Remember, 3 drops of the tincture morning and night, not more. I'll see you next week." After the old man departed, Thomas turned to Elizabeth. "I apologize for Mr. Harding's lack of act. Many in this town speak before considering their words." "No apology necessary," Elizabeth replied, returning to the ledger. "I'd prefer direct questions to whispers behind my back." Thomas watched her for a moment. "How was your first day of teaching?" "Educational," she said with a small smile. "For me, primarily. The children are bright but undisciplined. It will take time to establish proper order." He nodded. "Most new endeavors do." He gestured to a door at the back of the clinic. "I've prepared a list of herbal preparations we're low on, if you'd like to begin there. The workroom has everything you'll need." The workroom proved to be a small but well-equipped space, with dried herbs hanging from the ceiling, jars of various substances lining shelves, and a workbench with mortar and pestle, scales, and other tools of preparation. Elizabeth surveyed it with approval. This, at least, was familiar territory from her days assisting the housekeeper in Boston. She set to work on the list Thomas had provided: feverfew tincture, willow bark tea, comfrey salve for bruises, and several other basic remedies. The methodical nature of the work soothed her, and she lost track of time as she measured, ground, and mixed. "You have a practiced hand." She looked up to find Thomas standing in the doorway, observing her work. "My mother suffered frequent headaches," Elizabeth explained, continuing to stir the mixture before her. "Our housekeeper taught me which preparations helped most. From there, my interest grew." He entered the room fully, examining the bottles. She had already completed. "These are well prepared, better than my recent attempts." Elizabeth glanced at his right hand, understanding the unspoken challenge he faced. Fine motor control, essential for so many medical tasks, was clearly difficult for him. "My hands are steady," she offered. "Yours hold the knowledge of how these remedies should be prepared. Between us, the work is complete." Something flickered in his eyes, surprise perhaps, or the recognition of a truth he hadn't articulated. He nodded slowly. "A fair assessment." He cleared his throat. "I have rounds to make, several patients on the outskirts of town. The clinic will be quiet for the remainder of the afternoon. You may leave when you finish those preparations." "I can continue with the patient records if you'd prefer," Elizabeth suggested. "Your notes from yesterday need transcribing, and there appear to be several letters requiring responses." Thomas hesitated. "The writing, it's become difficult. My notes may not be easily legible." "I've deciphered my father's academic scrawl for years," Elizabeth said lightly. "I suspect your handwriting, even compromised, is clearer than his ever was." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Very well. The ledger system is straightforward. Patient name, date, complaint, treatment, fee. Letters can wait until I return." After he departed, Elizabeth returned to the front desk, spreading Thomas's notes before her. His handwriting was indeed challenging. Not naturally poor, but rather the work of someone fighting against physical limitation, the letters starting confidently before deteriorating into cramped, uneven shapes by the end of each entry. She worked steadily through the afternoon, transferring the information into the main ledger in her clear, precise script. As she did, patterns emerged: the frequency of certain complaints, rheumatism, winter coughs, minor injuries, Thomas's preferred treatments, the sliding scale of fees he seemed to apply based on patients' means rather than services rendered. The clinic door opened several times, patients coming for remedies Elizabeth could provide, or seeking Dr. Walker and leaving messages instead. She maintained careful records of each interaction, growing more comfortable in the role as the hours passed. By the time Thomas returned, darkness had fallen completely, and Elizabeth had lit the lamps against the gathering gloom. He stamped snow from his boots at the door, looking weary from his rounds. "You're still here," he observed, surprise evident in his voice. "There was work to complete," she replied simply, closing the ledger. "And it seemed easier to continue than to return in the morning before school." Thomas shed his coat, moving to the stove to warm his hands. Elizabeth noticed how he held his right hand close to the heat, flexing the fingers slowly, painfully. "The cold worsens it," she said quietly. He didn't pretend to misunderstand. "Yes, especially damp cold. Like today." He didn't look at her as he added, "Shrapnel at Gettysburg. Field hospital was overwhelmed. By the time someone attended to my hand, infection had set in. They saved it, but..." He flexed the fingers again, demonstrating their limited movement. "Yet you continued as a doctor. What else would I do?" He turned to face her. "Medicine is all I know, all I am." The simplicity of the statement, not self-pitying but matter-of-fact, resonated with Elizabeth. How often had she defined herself by what remained rather than what was lost? "I've completed the transcriptions," she said, changing the subject, "and prepared the remedies on your list. Is there anything else you require before I leave?" Thomas approached the desk, examining her work with evident approval. "This is extremely helpful. Thank you." "Ooh, it's what you're paying me for," Elizabeth reminded him, but without sharpness. "Nevertheless, I appreciate thoroughness." He hesitated. "Tomorrow is your first day in your new apartment." "Yes, I have little to move, fortunately." "The stairs," he began, then stopped himself. "I'm sure you've considered the challenges." "I have," she acknowledged. "They're manageable." He nodded, accepting her assessment without further question, a courtesy she rarely experienced. Friday then? After school?" "I'll be here." Elizabeth gathered her shawl, preparing to brave the cold once more. "Good night, Dr. Walker." "Thomas," he corrected gently. "Thomas," she echoed, the name still unfamiliar on her tongue. "Good night." Outside, the temperature had dropped further, stars emerging in a crystal-clear sky that promised bitter cold by morning. Elizabeth moved carefully along the icy boardwalk, mindful of each step. Her leg ached fiercely, protesting the long day of standing and walking, but beneath the discomfort was a deeper sensation: satisfaction. For the first time since arriving in Pinewood Creek, Elizabeth felt not merely present, but purposeful. She had stood before a classroom of children, commanding their attention, if not yet their respect. She had proven her worth in the clinic, completing tasks that clearly lightened Thomas's burden. Small victories, perhaps, but together they formed the foundation of something she had thought lost forever in Boston: the sense of being necessary. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: the move to her apartment, another day with her students, the gradual process of establishing herself in this community that still viewed her with suspicion. But tonight, making her way back to Martha's store for one final evening, Elizabeth Morrison walked with her chin lifted. Her steps, though uneven, deliberately placed. She was no longer merely surviving. She was beginning, at last, to build. The move to the apartment above the milliner's shop proved more challenging than Elizabeth had anticipated. Though her possessions were few, navigating the narrow staircase repeatedly left her breathless, her weakened leg trembling with exertion. By the third trip, she paused halfway up, leaning against the wall to rest, her small bundle of books clutched to her chest. "Miss Morrison?" Elizabeth startled, looking down to see Thomas Walker at the bottom of the stairs, his medical bag in his left hand. She hadn't heard him enter the stairwell. "Dr. Walker, I didn't expect..." "I was checking on Mrs. Jenkins next door," he explained. "I saw you moving your belongings earlier." He hesitated, then added, "Would you accept some assistance?" Pride warred with practicality in Elizabeth's mind. She had insisted she could manage independently, yet here she was, barely halfway up a staircase she would need to navigate daily, already exhausted. "That would be appreciated," she finally said, continuing her ascent to make room for him to follow. Thomas handed her his medical bag to carry, then took the larger bundle of her remaining possessions in his stronger left arm. They climbed together in silence, Elizabeth setting a pace that accommodated both her limitation and his. The apartment seemed smaller with another person in it, especially one as tall as Thomas. He set her belongings carefully on the small table, glancing around the space with what Elizabeth hoped wasn't pity. "It's modest," she acknowledged, "but sufficient for my needs." Thomas nodded. "I lived in smaller quarters during medical school." His gaze fell on the stove, cold and empty. "Have you provisions for tonight?" "Martha sent bread and preserves," Elizabeth replied, unwilling to admit she hadn't yet determined how she would manage regular cooking with her limited resources. As if reading her thoughts, Thomas moved to examine the stove. "The flue needs a cleaning," he observed, "and you'll need coal." He straightened. "I could send Tim Hayward over with some from the clinic's supply. The boy works odd jobs for me." Elizabeth hesitated. "I wouldn't want to impose—" "It's not imposition," Thomas interrupted. "It's practical. A doctor can hardly allow his assistant to fall ill from cold." His tone was matter-of-fact, stripping the offer of charity's sting. "Besides, Tim needs the work. His family struggles since his father's accident at the mill." Put that way, refusing seemed selfish. "Thank you," Elizabeth said. "I would appreciate Tim's help with the coal." Thomas nodded, satisfied. "I'll send him tomorrow morning before school." He retrieved his medical bag from where she'd set it. "The clinic ledger looks improved after your attention yesterday. Your organizational skills are impressive." The compliment, delivered with such formal precision, brought unexpected warmth to Elizabeth's cheeks. "My father believed proper record-keeping was the foundation of academic integrity. I merely applied his principles to your patient records. Nevertheless, it's valuable work." He moved toward the door, then paused. "The temperature will drop further tonight. Extra blankets are advisable." Elizabeth glanced at the single thin quilt she'd brought from Boston. "I'll manage." Thomas studied her for a moment, then nodded once before departing, his footsteps echoing down the wooden stairs. Alone again, Elizabeth surveyed her new home. The bare walls and empty cupboards reflected the sparse reality of her circumstances, yet the space was hers alone. No landlord monitoring her comings and goings, no charitable hostess watching her with concerned eyes. Independence, even in such modest form, was worth the hardship it entailed. She unpacked methodically, arranging her few books on the windowsill, hanging her dresses on pegs along the wall, placing her mother's hairbrush on the small crate that would serve as a bedside table. The routines of domesticity, however simple, helped settle the anxiety that had accompanied her throughout the day. A knock at the door startled her from these tasks. Opening it, Elizabeth found Martha Wilson, arms laden with a bundle wrapped in brown paper. "Housewarming," Martha explained gruffly, pushing past Elizabeth into the apartment. She set the bundle on the table and began unwrapping it, revealing a copper kettle, 2 tin cups, a small cooking pot, and several other kitchen essentials. "Mrs. Wilson, I can't possibly—" "Martha," the older woman corrected. "And you can. Most of these were gathering dust in my storeroom anyway." She surveyed the apartment with a critical eye. Samuel Pierce should be ashamed, charging $4 for this place. The roof likely leaks come spring thaw. "It's shelter," Elizabeth said simply. and centrally located between the school and clinic. Martha snorted. Practical to a fault, aren't you? She moved to the window, testing its seal against the growing cold outside. Thomas mentioned you might need a few necessities, said you were too proud to ask. Elizabeth felt a flash of indignation. Dr. Walker and I barely exchanged 10 sentences. He's observant, Martha replied. Comes with the profession. She turned back to Elizabeth. The town's forming opinions about you. Most are waiting to see if you'll flee back to Boston at the first real snow. I won't, Elizabeth said firmly. I know that. Thomas knows it too. Martha unwrapped a final package, revealing a thick woolen blanket. For tonight, temperatures dropping to near zero. This time, Elizabeth didn't protest. The practicality that defined her character recognized necessity when it presented itself. Thank you, Martha. Get some rest, the older woman advised. Those children will test your mettle again tomorrow, and they'll notice any weakness. She paused at the door. You're doing fine, Eliza. Better than fine. After Martha departed, Elizabeth prepared for bed, grateful for the additional blanket as the temperature continued to fall. Through the thin wall separating her apartment from the neighboring building, she could hear muffled voices, occasional laughter, reminders that she existed within a community now, surrounded by lives intersecting with her own in ways yet to be discovered. Sleep came fitfully, her body still adjusting to the day's exertions and the unfamiliar surroundings. In the deepest part of night, she woke to complete darkness and profound cold, her breath visible in the faint moonlight filtering through the frosted window. The fire in the small stove had died completely. Shivering, Elizabeth wrapped Martha's blanket more tightly around herself. Tomorrow, Tim would bring coal, and she would learn to bank the fire properly to last through the night. Another skill to master, another adaptation to make. As she drifted back to sleep, Elizabeth found comfort in the challenge rather than despair. Each difficulty overcome was further proof that Harold Blackwood had been wrong about her limitations. Morning arrived with a crystalline brightness that belied the bitter cold. Elizabeth dressed quickly, fingers stiff, adding her shawl over her warmest dress before attempting to relight the stove. Her efforts produced more smoke than heat, and she was still struggling when another knock came at her door. A boy of about 12 stood on the landing, a coal scuttle in his hands, his cheeks red from cold. "Miss Morrison, I'm Tim Hayward. Dr. Walker sent me with your coal." "Perfect timing," Elizabeth said with relief, stepping back to allow him entry. "I'm afraid I'm having some difficulty with the stove." Tim set down the coal and moved to examine the stove with the confidence of experience. "Flue's closed, miss, and the kindling's too damp." He reached into his pocket, producing a small package. "Doc sent these too, fire starters he makes. Work real good." Within minutes, Tim had a respectable fire going, the small stove beginning to radiate much-needed warmth. Elizabeth watched, making mental notes of his technique. "Doc says you're working at the clinic now," Tim said as he worked. "And teaching at the school." "That's right." Tim nodded thoughtfully. "My sister Hannah's in your class. She said you talked about your leg yesterday, how it got weak from being sick." Elizabeth tensed slightly. "I did. My pa's back it broke at the mill last year," Tim continued matter-of-factly. "Can't walk at all now. Doc Walker's the only one who didn't tell Ma to put him in a home." The simple statement revealed volumes about Thomas Walker's character and about the community's attitude toward disability. Dr. Walker seems to understand that physical limitations don't define a person's worth, Elizabeth said carefully. "He said the same about you," Tim replied, straightening from his work at the stove, "when Mr. Thompson was saying at the barber shop that the school board made a mistake hiring a crippled woman." Elizabeth concealed her reaction to this frank revelation, and what did Dr. Walker say in response? Said Mr. Thompson should worry less about your leg and more about his own children's poor arithmetic. Tim grinned suddenly. Doc doesn't talk much, but when he does, people listen. After Tim departed, promising to return the following morning to help with the stove again, Elizabeth prepared for her day with renewed determination. The knowledge that Thomas Walker had defended her publicly strengthened her resolve to prove his judgment sound. The school day passed more smoothly than her first. The children, having satisfied their initial curiosity about her condition, seemed to accept her authority with less resistance. Elizabeth divided them into their ability groups again, focusing particular attention on the youngest students who had clearly received the least consistent instruction during the interim between teachers. By afternoon, a routine was emerging. Advanced students working independently on compositions or mathematics, while Elizabeth guided the younger children through their letters and numbers. Her leg ached from standing, but she had positioned her desk strategically, allowing her to teach while seated for portions of the day without losing command of the classroom. When the final bell rang at 3 o'clock, Elizabeth found herself genuinely reluctant to end the day's lessons. The steady improvement she already observed in several students, particularly shy Hannah Haywood, who had correctly read an entire passage aloud for the first time, gave her a sense of accomplishment that transcended physical discomfort. Walking to the clinic afterward, Elizabeth mentally prepared for her second afternoon as Thomas's assistant. Their brief interaction that morning during her move had shifted something in their dynamic. Not quite friendship, but perhaps mutual. Recognition of shared circumstance, both adapting to bodies that resisted their wills, both determined to contribute despite limitations imposed by biology and society's expectations. The clinic was busier than her first day. A minor accident at the lumber mill had resulted in several injured workers requiring attention, and Thomas was in the midst of stitching a deep cut when Elizabeth arrived. "Miss Morrison," he acknowledged without looking up from his work. "Additional bandages are needed. Recently boiled ones are in the back room." Elizabeth moved efficiently to retrieve the supplies, maintaining the calm demeanor she had cultivated during her father's worst days of illness. Blood and injury didn't disturb her. They were simply physical realities requiring practical responses. She worked alongside Thomas for the next 2 hours, handing him instruments, preparing bandages, speaking soothingly to patients awaiting treatment. The work was physically demanding but deeply satisfying. Each task completed a direct contribution to another's well-being. When the last injured worker had been treated and departed, Thomas sank into the chair behind his desk, flexing his right hand carefully. Elizabeth noticed the subtle grimace that crossed his features before his professional mask slipped back into place. "The repetitive motion of stitching aggravates it," she observed quietly, beginning to clean and organize the instruments they had used. Thomas didn't deny it. Some days are better than others. "Have you tried a warm compress with arnica oil? It can reduce inflammation." He glanced up at her. "I'm familiar with the treatment, yes." "Familiarity doesn't ensure application," Elizabeth replied, her tone gentle rather than scolding. "Doctors notoriously neglect their own care while attending to others." A faint smile touched Thomas's lips. "An accusation I can't dispute." He watched as she continued organizing the workspace. "You handled yourself well today. Many find the sight of such injuries distressing." "My father's illness involved significant physical decline," Elizabeth said simply. "I learned to separate emotional response from necessary action." Thomas nodded, understanding in his eyes. "A valuable skill in medicine." He hesitated, then asked, "Was it consumption?" "Yes, My mother followed within 6 months of his passing. The doctors said grief weakened her constitution, though I suspect she may have contracted the disease while nursing him. I'm sorry, Thomas said quietly. Losing both parents in such short succession must have been incredibly difficult. Elizabeth continued her work, focusing on the methodical wiping of instruments rather than the memory of those dark days. It clarified certain realities, she said finally. Without family protection, my options as an unmarried woman with a disability became extremely limited. Hence the mail order arrangement. Yes. She looked up, meeting his gaze directly. I don't regret the attempt, despite the outcome. Remaining in Boston meant eventual destitution or dependency on distant relatives who had made their disinterest clear. Thomas held her gaze. And now, do you regret remaining in Pinewood Creek? The question seemed to carry weight beyond simple curiosity. Elizabeth considered her answer carefully. No, she said finally. The circumstances of my arrival were humiliating, certainly, but I've found meaningful work here and the possibility of building something sustainable. She paused. Independence has always been my primary goal, however modest the form it takes. A worthy ambition, Thomas replied, his tone suggesting personal understanding of its value. They worked in companionable silence for the remainder of the afternoon, Elizabeth completing the patient records while Thomas prepared remedies for several regular patients expected the following day. The easy rhythm of shared tasks, accomplished without need for constant direction or discussion, suggested a natural compatibility that neither would have predicted from their initial meeting. As evening approached, Thomas insisted on walking Elizabeth back to her apartment, citing the icy conditions of the boardwalks as justification. They moved slowly through the gathering darkness, their pace matched without conscious effort, neither commenting on the accommodations subtly made for the other's limitations. At the entrance to her building, Elizabeth paused. "Thank you for defending me to Mayor Thompson," she said directly. "Tim Hayward mentioned your intervention at the barber shop." Thomas looked momentarily uncomfortable. Thompson speaks without thinking. His opinions required correction. "Nevertheless, your support means a great deal, particularly as I'm still establishing myself here." He nodded once, accepting her gratitude without diminishing it. "Will Tim's assistance with the stove be sufficient? The milliner might allow you to use her back entrance in severe weather, avoiding the external stairs." "I'll manage," Elizabeth assured him, touched by his practical concern. "I've already developed a system for the most difficult tasks." Thomas didn't press further, respecting her autonomy in a way few others did. "Good night then. I'll see you at the clinic tomorrow." "Good night, Thomas." The week established a pattern that gradually solidified into routine. Elizabeth rose early each morning, with Tim's help maintaining the temperamental stove. School. Hours were filled with the organized chaos of teaching multiple levels simultaneously, her confidence growing as the children responded to her consistent, firm approach. Afternoons at the clinic provided different but equally meaningful challenges, her working relationship with Thomas evolving into a quietly efficient partnership. By Friday, Elizabeth felt settled enough in her new life to begin adding personal touches to her apartment. She purchased a small pot of dried lavender from Martha's store, placing it on the windowsill beside her books. From scraps of fabric, donated by the milliner downstairs, she fashioned a simple cushion for the hard wooden chair, easing the discomfort of evenings spent grading student work or transcribing clinic records she sometimes brought home. These small improvements coincided with a growing sense of acceptance within the community. Parents began greeting her respectfully when dropping off their children at school. Patients at the clinic no longer looked surprised to see her assisting Thomas. Even Samuel Pierce nodded acknowledgement when passing her on the street. Minimal, Courtesy, perhaps, but progress nonetheless. Saturday morning dawned bright and cold, the overnight snow creating a pristine blanket across Pinewood Creek. With no school duties, Elizabeth took advantage of the extra time to thoroughly clean her apartment and wash her clothing, tasks that required careful management of her limited energy. She was hanging her damp dresses near the stove to dry when a knock came at her door. Opening it, she found Thomas, his cheeks reddened from cold, a covered basket in his left hand. "Good morning," he greeted her, seeming slightly uncomfortable. "I apologize for the intrusion on your day of rest." "Not at all," Elizabeth replied, surprised by his unexpected visit. "Is everything all right at the clinic?" "Yes, quite well." He hesitated. "I've come with a proposition of sorts." Elizabeth raised an eyebrow, stepping back to invite him inside. Thomas entered, setting the basket on her small table. "Mrs. Miller, whose baby I delivered recently, sent payment in the form of preserves and fresh bread," he explained. "Too much for one person. I thought perhaps you might help prevent waste." Elizabeth recognized the gentle fiction for what it was. Not charity, but the sharing of abundance between colleagues. "That's very thoughtful. Would you like tea? I was just about to make some." Thomas appeared momentarily startled by the invitation, then nodded. "Yes, thank you." As Elizabeth prepared the tea, Thomas remained standing, looking slightly out of place in the small room. His gaze fell on the books arranged on her windowsill. "Wordsworth," he observed, noting the volume of poetry. "Do you enjoy his work?" "It was my father's favorite," Elizabeth replied, passing him a cup of tea. "He particularly valued Wordsworth's observations on nature's impact on the human spirit. The world is too much with us. Late and soon, getting and spending, we lay waste our powers," Thomas quoted softly. Elizabeth looked at him with new interest. "You're familiar with his poetry?" A faint flush colored Thomas's cheeks. "I had a classical education before medical school. Literature was a respite during the war. Books were scarce, but occasionally available." This glimpse of Thomas, beyond his professional identity, intrigued Elizabeth. "Please sit," she invited, gesturing to the chair she'd cushioned, "unless you're needed at the clinic." "Saturday mornings are typically quiet," he replied, carefully settling into the offered seat. "I have rounds this afternoon, but nothing pressing at the moment." They sipped their tea in surprisingly comfortable silence for a few moments before Thomas spoke again. "The school board is pleased with your progress," he said. "Reverend Collins mentioned that attendance has improved since you began teaching." "The children are eager to learn," Elizabeth replied. "They simply needed consistent structure and expectations." "And at the clinic? Is the work satisfactory?" Elizabeth detected an unusual hesitancy in his question. "Very much so," she assured him. "I find the work meaningful, and our methods seem to complement each other well." Thomas nodded, setting down his teacup. "I've been considering expanding your role, if you're amenable. Some patients, particularly women with certain complaints, might benefit from speaking with you directly. You have a calming presence and practical understanding that inspires confidence." The offer represented significant professional trust. "I'd be honored," Elizabeth said, "though I should emphasize my medical knowledge is limited to practical experience rather than formal training." "Experience often teaches what textbooks cannot," Thomas replied, "and you'll consult with me on any cases beyond your comfort." He hesitated. "There would be additional compensation, of course." "That's generous," Elizabeth acknowledged. "But may I ask what prompted this proposal?" Thomas considered his response carefully. "Efficiency, partially. The clinic could serve more patients with your increased involvement." He paused. "And observation of your capabilities. You have a natural aptitude for the work, perceptive, thorough, unflappable under pressure. It seems wasteful not to. Utilize those qualities more fully. The compliment, delivered with such matter-of-fact conviction, warmed Elizabeth more than she expected. "Thank you for your confidence in me." Their conversation drifted to other topics. The progress of specific students, weather predictions for the coming weeks, books they had both read. Elizabeth found herself increasingly comfortable in Thomas's presence, his formal demeanor softening as they discovered shared interests and compatible perspectives. When he finally rose to leave, promising to bring patient guidelines for her, expanded role at their next clinic session, Elizabeth realized 2 hours had passed in what felt like moments. "I've taken too much of your Saturday," Thomas said apologetically. "Not at all," Elizabeth assured him. "The company was welcome." She hesitated, then added, "Perhaps we might continue our literary discussion another time. I have few opportunities for such conversations in Pinewood Creek." Something like pleasure flickered in Thomas's eyes. "I would enjoy that very much." After he departed, Elizabeth stood at her window, watching his tall figure move carefully along the snowy street below. Their interaction had shifted subtly today, moving beyond professional cooperation toward something that might, in time, resemble friendship. The thought brought unexpected warmth. Elizabeth had come to Pinewood Creek seeking security and independence, lowering her expectations of emotional connection after Harold Blackwood's cruel rejection. She had not anticipated finding someone who might see beyond her physical limitation to recognize the person beneath. Someone who, perhaps, understood the experience of being defined by others' perceptions rather than one's own capabilities. As Sunday dawned, Elizabeth prepared for her first church attendance in Pinewood Creek, knowing it represented another important step in community integration. She wore her best dress, a dark blue wool with minimal adornment, and arranged her hair with particular care, aware that impressions formed today would circulate widely through the small town. The church was nearly full when she arrived. Families arranged in familiar pews, conversations hushing briefly as she entered. Elizabeth hesitated in the doorway, uncertain where to sit, when Martha Wilson appeared at her elbow. "Join me," she instructed without preamble, leading Elizabeth to a pew midway down the aisle. First church attendance is always a spectacle. In small towns, best to have an established ally. Elizabeth smiled gratefully, settling beside the older woman. She was acutely conscious of the gazes directed her way. Some curious, others speculative, a few openly disapproving. Harold Blackwood sat near the front, with a stern-faced woman Elizabeth assumed was his sister Ruth. Neither acknowledged her presence. As the congregation rose for the opening hymn, Elizabeth noticed Thomas entering quietly, taking a place in the last pew. She hadn't expected to see him. Martha had mentioned he rarely attended services, often called away by medical emergencies. Their eyes met briefly across the church, his slight nod of greeting barely perceptible, but somehow reassuring. Reverend Collins's sermon focused on community and acceptance, with pointed references to scriptural passages about looking beyond outward appearances to the heart within. Elizabeth wondered if the topic had been chosen with her presence in mind, particularly when the Reverend's gaze seemed to linger on her during key passages. After the service, members of the congregation gathered outside despite the cold, the social aspect of church attendance clearly as important as the spiritual. Elizabeth found herself approached by several mothers of her students, their initial reserve gradually warming as they inquired about their children's progress. "Timothy's reading has improved remarkably," Mrs. Henderson commented, genuine approval. In her voice, "He's never shown such interest in books before. He has natural aptitude," Elizabeth replied, "particularly for stories with adventure elements. I've been selecting material that engages his specific interests." "Well, it's working," Mrs. Henderson acknowledged. "His father and I are most pleased." Similar conversations followed, each interaction building Elizabeth's confidence in her place within the community. Not everyone approached her. Several families, including the Blackwoods, departed without acknowledgement, but enough expressed cautious acceptance to suggest her position was strengthening. Thomas remained at the periphery of these social exchanges, speaking briefly with Reverend Collins before beginning to walk back toward the clinic. On impulse, Elizabeth excused herself from her current conversation and made her way toward him, her progress slowed by her careful navigation across the icy churchyard. "Dr. Walker," she called, catching his attention. "A moment if you have one." He paused, waiting for her to reach him. "Miss Morrison, I trust you found the service welcoming?" "Pointed, perhaps, but well-intentioned," she replied with a small smile. "I wanted to thank you for the bread and preserves. They made an excellent breakfast this morning." "I'm glad. They were useful." Elizabeth hesitated, then continued, "I also wanted to invite you to dinner on Tuesday evening, if you're available. Nothing elaborate, but I've been experimenting with soup recipes that stretch limited ingredients. Consider it repayment for your generosity." Thomas appeared momentarily taken aback by the invitation. "That's not necessary." "I understand it isn't necessary," Elizabeth interrupted gently, "but it would be pleasant, I think. Professional colleagues sharing a meal and conversation." He studied her face, perhaps searching for hidden motives or obligations. Finding none, he nodded slowly. "Tuesday would be fine. Thank you. 6 o'clock. "I'll bring wine," he offered, "from my personal supply. Nothing elaborate either." Elizabeth smiled. "Perfect." As they parted ways, Elizabeth felt several curious gazes following their interaction. No doubt the invitation would fuel town gossip. The crippled schoolteacher entertaining the war-wounded doctor, two damaged souls finding common ground. Let them talk, she thought with unexpected defiance. Neither she nor Thomas had allowed physical limitations to determine their capabilities. Why should they allow community speculation to dictate their association? Monday and Tuesday passed, in a blur of teaching, clinic work, and preparation for the dinner. Elizabeth spent her meager savings on fresh ingredients from Martha's store, determined to create a meal that would demonstrate both competence and consideration. The vegetable soup simmered slowly throughout Tuesday afternoon, filling her small apartment with welcoming aromas of rosemary and thyme. At precisely 6 o'clock, Thomas's knock came at her door. He stood somewhat stiffly on the landing, a bottle of wine in his left hand, his right tucked partially into his coat pocket, as it often was in social situations. "Good evening," Elizabeth greeted him warmly. "Please come in." Thomas entered, his gaze taking in the transformed apartment. Elizabeth had rearranged the furniture to create a more congenial dining space, using an old crate covered with a clean cloth as a second chair. A few winter evergreen branches in a glass jar served as a centerpiece for her small table, and she had splurged on 2 candles whose gentle light softened the room's sparse furnishings. "It smells wonderful," Thomas commented, handing her the wine. "I'm afraid I have limited expertise in selecting wine, but the merchant assured me this would complement a hearty soup." "I'm certain it will be perfect," Elizabeth assured him, genuinely touched by his thoughtfulness. "Please make yourself comfortable while I serve." As they settled into the simple meal, the initial awkwardness of their unusual social arrangement gradually melted away. Conversation flowed more easily than Elizabeth had anticipated, ranging from clinic matters to literary discussions to cautious personal revelations. Thomas spoke briefly of his childhood in Philadelphia, his decision to pursue medicine, his time as an army surgeon. Elizabeth shared memories of her father's academic pursuits, her mother's gentle guidance. The gradual adjustment to life after her illness changed her physical capabilities. Neither explicitly mentioned their disabilities, yet understanding of their shared experience underscored each exchange. When Elizabeth rose to refill their bowls and her leg briefly buckled, Thomas made no comment, simply steadied the table with his good hand to prevent the dishes from shifting. When he struggled momentarily with cutting the bread, she seamlessly continued her anecdote about a student's amusing mathematical error, giving him time to manage without embarrassment. "This was extremely enjoyable," Thomas said as the evening drew to a close. "Far better than my usual solitary dinner while reviewing patient notes." "I've enjoyed it as well," Elizabeth replied sincerely. "Perhaps we might make it a regular occurrence. Alternating locations, of course. Your quarters must be more spacious than mine." Thomas hesitated, an unreadable expression crossing his features. "My living arrangements are utilitarian, but yes, I would welcome the company." He rose to leave. "Next Tuesday at the clinic, then? I'm a mediocre cook, but capable of basic sustenance." Perfect," Elizabeth agreed, walking him to the door. "Thank you for coming, Thomas, and for the wine." "Thank you for the invitation," he replied, "and for the excellent soup." He paused in the doorway, seeming on the verge of saying something more. Instead, he simply nodded. "Good night, Eliza." It was the first time he had used her preferred name. The sound of it in his deep voice lingered in her mind long after his footsteps had faded down the stairs. December arrived with a ferocity that tested even the most winter-hardened residents of Pinewood Creek. Snow fell relentlessly for 3 days, accumulating in drifts that transformed the town into an almost unrecognizable landscape of white mounds and narrow pathways carved between buildings. The temperature plummeted further than Elizabeth had experienced even in Boston. The cold, a living presence that seeped through every crack and crevice of her small apartment. The twice-weekly dinners she shared with Thomas had become the brightest points in her increasingly challenging routine. They alternated locations as agreed, though Thomas's quarters behind the clinic proved only marginally larger than her own, a testament to his modest lifestyle despite his professional status. These evenings provided more than simple companionship. They offered a space where neither had to maintain the careful facades they presented to the rest of Pinewood Creek. As Christmas approached, Elizabeth found herself caught in the town's preparations despite her limited resources. Her students were creating decorations for the schoolhouse, their enthusiasm infectious, even as she worried about heating the building adequately during the final week of classes before the holiday break. Several families had invited her to Christmas dinner, a marked change from her initial reception that she recognized as significant progress in her community integration. She was considering these invitations while walking to the clinic one Wednesday afternoon when a commotion ahead caught her attention. A wagon had overturned at the corner of Main Street and Cedar, its load of lumber scattered across the snow-packed road. Several men were already helping the driver, who appeared shaken but unharmed. Elizabeth would have continued past with nothing. More than sympathy had she not noticed Thomas rushing from the clinic toward the scene, his medical bag clutched in his left hand. Something in his urgent pace made her quicken her own steps, her weakened leg protesting the sudden exertion. As she drew closer, she realized the cause of Thomas's alarm. Beneath the overturned wagon, partially obscured by fallen lumber, lay a small figure in a blue coat. "It's Hannah Hayward," someone in the gathering crowd reported. "She was crossing to the general store when the horses spooked." Elizabeth's heart constricted at the name. Quiet, diligent Hannah, Tim's younger sister, who had finally begun to flourish under Elizabeth's teaching. The child who had written a composition just yesterday about her hope to become a teacher herself someday. Thomas was already kneeling in the snow beside the wagon, speaking in low, calm tones to the men who were cautiously removing lumber from around the trapped child. Elizabeth pushed through the onlookers, her teacher's authority creating a path where her physical presence might not have. "Thomas," she called softly as she reached him. "How can I help?" His expression showed momentary relief at her presence. "She's conscious but pinned. The wagon frame has her trapped, but it's supporting. A beam that would crush her if removed improperly. I need to assess her condition before they attempt extraction." Elizabeth nodded, immediately understanding her role. "I'll keep her calm while you examine her." She lowered herself carefully to the ground, ignoring the cold that immediately soaked through her skirts. From this angle, she could see Hannah's face, pale and frightened, a small trickle of blood running from her hairline. "Hannah," Elizabeth kept her voice steady and warm. "It's Miss Morrison. Dr. Walker is here to help you, and I'm going to stay right beside you. Can you tell me where it hurts?" The girl's eyes, wide with fear, focused on Elizabeth's face. My leg," she whimpered, "and I can't move. There's something heavy on me." "You're being very brave," Elizabeth assured her, reaching through the narrow gap to clasp the child's cold hand. "Dr. Walker needs to check you to make sure you're not injured anywhere else. Then these men will get the wagon off you very carefully." Thomas worked with focused precision, reaching beneath the wagon to assess Hannah's condition, his face betraying nothing that might frighten the child further. Elizabeth maintained a gentle stream of conversation, asking Hannah about her Christmas plans, her favorite carols, anything to keep her engaged and distracted from the seriousness of her situation. "The main beam is pressing across her right thigh," Thomas murmured to Elizabeth, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Significant pressure, possibly a fracture, but the circulation appears intact. Her other injuries seem superficial. The greater risk now is from moving the wagon improperly." Elizabeth nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. If the beam shifted during rescue, it could cause catastrophic damage to Hannah's leg, or worse. Thomas straightened, addressing the men who waited for his assessment. "We need to stabilize the wagon before lifting. The beam across her leg must be raised straight up, not shifted to either side." Tim Hayward arrived, breathless and terrified, having run from the mill where he worked part-time. "Hannah," he cried, trying to push forward. Elizabeth caught his arm. "Tim, she's awake and talking. Dr. Walker is taking care of her. The best way to help your sister now is to run to your parents and bring them here. Can you do that?" The boy hesitated, clearly torn between staying with his sister and following Elizabeth's instructions. "She's going to be all right. Dr. Walker and I won't leave her side," Elizabeth promised. "Go quickly now." As Tim departed, Thomas organized the rescue effort with calm authority. Additional men arrived with tools and support beams, working under his direction to stabilize the wagon before attempting to lift it. Elizabeth remained on the ground beside Hannah, speaking soothingly to the increasingly distressed child as the cold and pain intensified. "I'm scared, Miss Morrison," Hannah whispered, her small hand clutching Elizabeth's with surprising strength. "I know, dear one," Elizabeth replied, brushing snow from the girl's cheek. "But you're doing so well. Dr. Walker is very good at helping people, and these men are being very careful." Thomas knelt beside them again, meeting Hannah's frightened gaze. "Hannah, we're going to lift the wagon in just a moment. When we do, Miss Morrison will slide you out very gently. You must stay completely still, even if it hurts. Can you be brave for just a little longer?" The girl nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Good girl," Thomas said, with a gentleness Elizabeth had rarely heard from him. "I'll be right here watching to make sure everything goes perfectly." He moved back to direct the final preparations, positioning men at critical points around the wagon. Elizabeth shifted her weight, preparing to pull Hannah clear at the signal while keeping the pressure off her injured leg. "Ready," Thomas called, his voice steady and commanding. "Lift slowly, straight up." The men strained against the weight, the wagon creaking ominously as it began to rise. Elizabeth kept her eyes on Hannah's face, watching for signs of increased pain that might indicate the beam was shifting dangerously. "Now, Eliza," Thomas directed, when the wagon had risen barely 6 inches. "Slide her straight out, supporting the injured leg." Elizabeth moved immediately, her own discomfort forgotten as she carefully extracted Hannah from beneath the wagon, maintaining the alignment of the girl's leg exactly as Thomas had indicated. The child whimpered but remained still, her trust in her teacher evident even through her fear. Once Hannah was clear, Thomas signaled the men to lower the wagon, then immediately knelt to examine the girl more thoroughly. "Well done, Hannah," he praised as he gently assessed her injuries. "You've been extraordinarily brave." Elizabeth remained beside them, snow soaking through her dress, her hand still clasped firmly in Hannah's. She watched Thomas's face for clues to the severity of the child's condition, recognizing the slight tension around his eyes that suggested concern beyond what he was expressing aloud. "The leg is definitely fractured," he confirmed quietly to Elizabeth. "We need to get her to the clinic immediately, before the Haywoods arrive. Emotional parents will only increase her distress." Elizabeth nodded, understanding the medical necessity of immediate action. "I'll explain to them when they come." Thomas carefully splinted Hannah's leg with supplies from his medical bag, then lifted the child in his arms, favoring his stronger left side, but managing the weight with determined steadiness. "Stay with her," he instructed as they moved toward the clinic. "She trusts you." The next hours passed in a blur of focused activity. Thomas worked methodically to set Hannah's broken bone, his damaged right hand supported by his left for the most delicate manipulations. Elizabeth assisted without needing direction, anticipating his requirements, speaking soothingly to Hannah throughout the painful procedure, and later explaining everything to the distraught Haywood family. When they arrived, "The break is clean," Thomas assured Mrs. Haywood as she wept beside her daughter's cot. "Children's bones heal remarkably well. With proper care, she should recover completely." "But how will we manage?" Mr. Haywood asked, his face drawn with worry. "I can barely work with my back. As it is, Sarah needs to mind the younger ones. We can't provide constant care for Hannah at home." Thomas and Elizabeth exchanged glances, an unspoken understanding passing between them. "Hannah can stay at the clinic for the initial recovery. Period," Thomas offered. "I have a spare room that can be arranged for her. Miss Morrison has agreed to assist with her care during school hours, and I'll monitor her progress medically." The Haywoods' relief was palpable, though Mrs. Haywood glanced uncertainly between Thomas and Elizabeth. "It's very generous, Doctor, but we couldn't impose—" "It's not imposition," Elizabeth assured her. "It's practical medical care. Hannah will need consistent monitoring that would be difficult to provide at home, especially with your other responsibilities." "But the cost," Mr. Haywood began. "We can discuss arrangements later," Thomas interrupted smoothly. "For now, let's focus on making Hannah comfortable." After the Haywoods departed, promising to return the following day with clean clothes and Hannah's favorite doll, Thomas and Elizabeth set about preparing the small room adjacent to his quarters. It was sparsely furnished, but clean, with a narrow bed and a small window overlooking the back garden now covered in snow. "You're certain about this arrangement?" Thomas asked as they changed the linens. "It will mean additional hours beyond your current commitments." "Of course I'm certain," Elizabeth replied, tucking the blanket with practiced efficiency. "Hannah is my student. Besides, school closes for Christmas holiday next week, which simplifies matters considerably." Thomas nodded, arranging a water pitcher and cup on the bedside table. "The fracture concerns me," he admitted quietly. "It's not as straightforward. As I indicated to her parents, there's significant displacement that may affect her growth if it doesn't heal properly." Elizabeth absorbed this information, understanding why he had wanted Hannah under his direct supervision. "You're worried she might end up with a permanent limp," Yes, he met her gaze directly. I wanted you to understand the full situation, since you'll be involved in her care. Thank you for your honesty, Elizabeth said, and for not saying it in front of her parents yet. They have enough immediate concerns without borrowing future worries. Precisely my thinking. Thomas straightened, wincing slightly as he flexed his right hand. We should move her in here. The laudanum will wear off soon, and she'll be more comfortable settled before the pain increases. Together, they transferred the sleeping child to the prepared room, Thomas carrying her while Elizabeth managed the splinted leg. Hannah stirred but didn't fully wake, the medication still granting her temporary reprieve from pain. You should go home and change, Thomas said, noticing Elizabeth's still damp clothing. I can manage Hannah for now. Elizabeth shook her head. I'll stay until she wakes. She'll be frightened in unfamiliar surroundings. She arranged Hannah's splinted leg carefully on a pillow. Besides, we need to establish a care schedule. The Haywoods will need clear information about what to expect. Thomas didn't argue further, recognizing Elizabeth's determination. Instead, he brought her a woolen blanket to wrap around her shoulders against the chill of her wet clothing. I'll make tea, he said simply. They sat together beside Hannah's bed as evening settled over Pinewood Creek, discussing the practicalities of her care, medication schedules, exercises to prevent muscle atrophy, signs of complications to watch for. Their conversation had the comfortable rhythm of experienced colleagues, each respecting the other's expertise within their established domains. School ends next Friday, Elizabeth noted, organizing their shared responsibilities aloud. I can be here mornings and afternoons during the holiday break. The Haywoods can visit evenings, which allows them to maintain their work and family obligations. That leaves night supervision, Thomas mused. I can manage that initially, but I'll need to resume house calls within a few days. Elizabeth hesitated, then offered carefully, I could stay at the clinic overnight when necessary. The cot in your examination room would suffice. It would be more practical than traveling between our residences repeatedly during the worst of winter. Thomas glanced at her, clearly weighing the propriety of such an arrangement against its practical benefits. The town would talk, he said, finally. The town already talks, Elizabeth replied with unexpected lightness. My reputation was compromised the moment Harold Blackwood rejected me publicly. I doubt it can deteriorate much further. A faint smile touched Thomas's lips. Perhaps not. But yours isn't the only reputation at stake. As the town's physician, I must maintain certain standards. Of course, Elizabeth said, feeling suddenly foolish for suggesting such an unconventional arrangement. I didn't consider... However, Thomas continued, medical necessity provides significant latitude. If we present it as a professional arrangement necessitated by Hannah's condition, most reasonable people will accept it. He paused. Those who choose to think the worst would do so regardless of our precautions. Before Elizabeth could respond, Hannah stirred, whimpering softly as consciousness brought awareness of pain. Their personal considerations were immediately set aside as they focused on their patient, Thomas checking her splint while Elizabeth spoke soothingly, helping the disoriented child understand her surroundings. Miss Morrison, Hannah murmured, confusion evident in her voice. Where am I? You're at Dr. Walker's clinic, Elizabeth explained gently. You had an accident with the wagon, remember? Your leg was hurt, but Dr. Walker has fixed it. You're going to stay here for a little while so we can help you get better. Hannah's face crumpled. It hurts. I know, dear one. Elizabeth smoothed the girl's hair back from her forehead. Dr. Walker has medicine that will help with the pain. Thomas approached with a small dose of laudanum mixed with water. This will make you feel better, Hannah. Miss Morrison will stay right beside you while you fall asleep again." As Hannah drifted back into medicated slumber, Elizabeth maintained her vigil by the bedside, her own discomfort forgotten in her concern for the child. Thomas watched them both, his expression thoughtful. "You have a natural gift with children," he observed quietly. "They trust you instinctively." Elizabeth smiled faintly. "They haven't yet learned to see limitations as defining characteristics. Children accept difference more readily than adults, in my experience. An observation I've made as well." Thomas adjusted Hannah's blanket unnecessarily, his focus seemingly on the small task rather than his next words. "Elizabeth, regardless of what we decide about overnight arrangements, I want you to know that I value your assistance with Hannah enormously. Your presence today made a significant difference in the outcome." But the rare use of her full name and the sincerity in his tone caught Elizabeth's attention. "Thank you. That means a great deal coming from you." Their eyes met briefly, a moment of connection that acknowledged something beyond professional respect, a deepening personal regard neither had explicitly expressed. The moment stretched, then passed as Hannah shifted in her sleep, drawing their attention back to their shared responsibility. "You should go home and rest," Thomas said eventually. "Tomorrow will be demanding. I'll manage tonight." This time, Elizabeth didn't argue. The emotional and physical strain of the day had drained her resources, and her practical nature recognized the need for recuperation. "I'll return first thing in the morning," she promised, rising stiffly from her chair, her leg particularly uncooperative after hours of inactivity following exertion. Thomas noticed her difficulty, but didn't comment directly. "Take my lantern," he said instead. "The paths will be treacherous after dark." Elizabeth accepted both the lantern and his tacit understanding of her desire to manage independently. "Good night, Thomas. Send for me if Hannah's condition changes." "I will." He walked her to the clinic door, his hand briefly touching her elbow in a gesture that might have been simple courtesy or something more. "Be careful on the stairs to your apartment." The next 2 weeks established a rhythm none of them had anticipated. Hannah's care became the center around which their days revolved, the three forming an unexpected unit bound by necessity but sustained by growing affection. Thomas's initial concern about the complexity of Hannah's fracture proved warranted. The child struggled with pain and frustrated tears as her confinement extended beyond the first few days. Elizabeth discovered resources of patience she hadn't known she possessed, devising games and lessons to occupy Hannah's active mind while her body remained immobilized. She read aloud for hours, taught simple card games, and helped the girl create Christmas decorations for her small room from colored paper and scraps of ribbon. Thomas observed these interactions with quiet appreciation, occasionally joining their activities during brief respites from his other patients. His natural reserve softened in Hannah's presence, revealing a gentle humor Elizabeth had previously glimpsed only in their private dinners. The question of overnight supervision resolved itself pragmatically. During the first week, Elizabeth returned to her apartment each night, though the journey grew increasingly difficult as winter tightened its grip on Pinewood Creek. When a particularly vicious storm hit, leaving the streets nearly impassable, Thomas insisted she remain at the clinic, offering his own quarters while he took the examination room cot. "The arrangement is entirely proper," he assured her when she hesitated. "Hannah provides adequate chaperonage to satisfy even Reverend Collins." After that night, Elizabeth maintained a small trunk of essential items at the clinic, staying overnight when weather or Hannah's condition warranted. The Haywoods, far from objecting to this unconventional arrangement, expressed profound gratitude for the care their daughter received. "We couldn't have managed at home," Mrs. Hayward admitted to Elizabeth during one of her evening visits. "Not with the younger ones, and James is back the way it is. You and Dr. Walker have been a blessing beyond words." Christmas approached, with Hannah still confined to bed, though her spirits improved as her pain gradually subsided. Elizabeth decorated the clinic with evergreen boughs and red ribbons, creating a festive atmosphere that lifted everyone's mood. Thomas contributed a small pine tree for Hannah's room, surprising both Elizabeth and the child with this unexpected gesture of holiday spirit. "I didn't take you for a Christmas enthusiast," Elizabeth remarked as they decorated the tree with paper ornaments Hannah had created. "I'm not, generally," Thomas admitted, "but certain occasions merit special consideration." His gaze, warm with unspoken meaning, caused a flutter in Elizabeth's chest that she carefully suppressed. Their shared care of Hannah had created an intimacy neither had anticipated, domestic moments that sometimes felt like glimpses into a life Elizabeth had once dreamed of but abandoned after her illness changed her prospects. Such thoughts were dangerous, she reminded herself. Their arrangement was temporary, their connection based on Hannah's needs rather than personal inclination. Yet evidence suggested otherwise. Thomas now automatically adjusted his pace to match hers when they walked together. He remembered how she preferred her tea, prepared her cup without asking each morning. She, in turn, had learned to anticipate when his hand would trouble him, seamlessly taking over tasks that required fine dexterity without drawing attention to the transfer. They worked as a unit, communicating often without words, their movements around the clinic and Hannah's sick room choreographed by growing familiarity. Patients noticed, some commenting directly on the effective partnership they observed. Town gossip inevitably followed, though it seemed less malicious than Elizabeth had feared. "People are saying you two make a fine pair," Martha commented, bluntly during one of her visits to bring supplies. Professional and otherwise, Elizabeth felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Hannah's care requires close collaboration," Martha snorted. "Call it what you will. I haven't seen Thomas Walker look this alive since before the war." She fixed Elizabeth with a knowing gaze. "And you're flourishing too, despite the added burden. Some loads are lighter when properly shared." Elizabeth changed the subject, unwilling to examine too closely the emotions that had begun to complicate her feelings toward Thomas. Attachment was risky, particularly given their circumstances. She had come to Pinewood Creek seeking independence, not entanglement, yet she couldn't deny that her days at the clinic, even with their challenges, brought a fulfillment she hadn't experienced before. Christmas Eve arrived with a perfect stillness, snow falling in large, gentle flakes that muffled the town in pristine white. The Haywards visited in the afternoon, bringing gifts for Hannah and heartfelt thanks for her caregivers. By evening, the clinic was quiet, most patients choosing to delay minor complaints until after the holiday. Elizabeth sat beside Hannah's bed, reading A Christmas Carol aloud while Thomas finished his evening rounds. The girl's eyes grew heavy as the familiar story and the warmth of the small stove lulled her towards sleep. "Miss Morrison," Hannah murmured as Elizabeth paused in her reading. "Yes, dear. Will my leg be like yours when it heals?" The question, asked with a child's directness, caught Elizabeth by surprise. "Tim says I might walk different after." Elizabeth considered her response carefully. "Dr. Walker is doing everything possible to help your leg heal properly," she said. "But even if you do walk differently afterward, it wouldn't define you. Look at me. I teach school, assist Dr. Walker, and manage my own household. A different way of walking is just that, different, not lesser." Hannah nodded thoughtfully. "Dr. Walker's hand is different too, but he's still the best doctor." "Exactly," Elizabeth smiled, touched by the child's simple wisdom. "Our challenges can make us more understanding, more resourceful. Sometimes they even connect us to people we might not have known otherwise." "Like you and Dr. Walker?" Hannah asked, her expression innocently perceptive. Before Elizabeth could formulate a response, Thomas appeared in the doorway, a small package in his hand. "I think someone should be sleeping if she expects St. Nicholas to visit," he said, his tone gently teasing. Hannah's eyes widened. "But I'm not at home. How will he find me?" "I left a note on your front door," Thomas assured her with complete seriousness, directing him to the clinic. Elizabeth marveled at this playful side of Thomas, so rarely revealed except in Hannah's presence. The child giggled, nestling deeper into her pillows. "May I open one present tonight, please?" she begged. "It's tradition." Thomas glanced at Elizabeth, who nodded her agreement. "One small gift seems appropriate given the special circumstances." Thomas straightened, addressing the men who waited for his assessment. "We need to stabilize the wagon before lifting. The beam across her leg must be raised straight up, not shifted to either side." Tim Hayward arrived, breathless and terrified, having run from the mill where he worked part-time. "Hannah!" he cried, trying to push forward. Elizabeth caught his arm. "Tim, she's awake and talking. Dr. Walker is taking care of her. The best way to help your sister now is to run to your parents and bring them here. Can you do that?" The boy hesitated, clearly torn between staying with his sister and following Elizabeth's instructions. "She's going to be all right. Dr. Walker and I won't leave her side," Elizabeth promised. "Go quickly now." As Tim departed, Thomas organized the rescue effort with calm authority. Additional men arrived with tools and support beams, working under his direction to stabilize the wagon before attempting to lift it. Elizabeth remained on the ground beside Hannah, speaking soothingly to the increasingly distressed child as the cold and pain intensified. "I'm scared, Miss Morrison," Hannah whispered, her small hand clutching Elizabeth's with surprising strength. "I know, dear one," Elizabeth replied, brushing snow from the girl's cheek. "But you're doing so well. Dr. Walker is very good at helping people. And these men are being very careful." Thomas knelt beside them again, meeting Hannah's frightened gaze. "Hannah, we're going to lift the wagon in just a moment. When we do, Miss Morrison will slide you out very gently. You must stay completely still, even if it hurts. Can you be brave for just a little longer?" The girl nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Good girl," Thomas said, with a gentleness Elizabeth had rarely heard from him. "I'll be right here watching to make sure everything goes perfectly." He moved back to direct the final preparations, positioning men at critical points around the wagon. Elizabeth shifted her weight, preparing to pull Hannah clear at the signal while keeping the pressure off her injured leg. "Ready," Thomas called, his voice steady and commanding. "Lift slowly, straight up." The men strained against the weight, the wagon creaking ominously as it began to rise. Elizabeth kept her eyes on Hannah's face, watching for signs of increased pain that might indicate the beam was shifting dangerously. "Now, Eliza," Thomas directed, when the wagon had risen barely 6 inches. "Slide her straight out, supporting the injured leg." Elizabeth moved immediately, her own discomfort forgotten as she carefully extracted Hannah from beneath the wagon, maintaining the alignment of the girl's leg exactly as Thomas had indicated. The child whimpered but remained still, her trust in her teacher evident even through her fear. Once Hannah was clear, Thomas signaled the men to lower the wagon, then immediately knelt to examine the girl more thoroughly. "Well done, Hannah," he praised as he gently assessed her injuries. "You've been extraordinarily brave." Elizabeth remained beside them, snow soaking through her dress, her hand still clasped firmly in Hannah's. She watched Thomas's face for clues to the severity of the child's condition, recognizing the slight tension around his eyes that suggested concern beyond what he was expressing aloud. "The leg is definitely fractured," he confirmed quietly to Elizabeth. "We need to get her to the clinic immediately, before the Haywards arrive. Emotional parents will only increase her distress." Elizabeth nodded, understanding the medical necessity of immediate action. "I'll explain to them when they come." Thomas carefully splinted Hannah's leg with supplies from his medical bag, then lifted the child in his arms, favoring his stronger left side, but managing the weight with determined steadiness. "Stay with her," he instructed as they moved toward the clinic. "She trusts you." The next hours passed in a blur of focused activity. Thomas worked methodically to set Hannah's broken bone, his damaged right hand supported by his left for the most delicate manipulations. Elizabeth assisted without needing direction, anticipating his requirements, speaking soothingly to Hannah throughout the painful procedure, and later explaining everything to the distraught Hayward family. When they arrived, "The break is clean," Thomas assured Mrs. Elizabeth looked up at him, suddenly aware of how close they stood, how private this moment felt, despite the semi-public setting of the clinic. "I could say the same of you," she admitted. "You saw me as capable when others saw only limitation." "I saw you," Thomas corrected gently, "just as you see me." The truth of this simple statement resonated deeply. In a world that often reduced them to their physical challenges, they had recognized each other's complete humanity, strengths, weaknesses, hopes, and fears. Thomas's hand moved slightly, as if he might reach for hers, then hesitated. "Elizabeth, I find myself considering possibilities I had long since abandoned," he said, the formal phrasing belying the emotion evident in his voice. "These weeks caring for Hannah together have revealed—" A sharp cry from Hannah's room interrupted whatever he might have said next. They both turned immediately toward the sound, professional concern displacing personal revelation in an instant. Hannah had awakened in pain, the laudanum having worn off completely for the first time in days. The next hour was consumed with medical attention, Thomas examining the leg for signs of complication, Elizabeth soothing the frightened child while preparing a fresh dose of medicine. By the time Hannah settled back into sleep, the intimate moment between them had passed, the practicalities of patient care reclaiming their focus. Yet something had shifted, an acknowledgement made that could not be unmade, words begun that would eventually require completion. As they sat together in the quiet clinic, Christmas Eve deepening toward midnight, Elizabeth felt a curious peace despite the interrupted conversation. Whatever Thomas had been about to say, whatever might develop between them, would unfold in its own time. For now, it was enough to share this quiet vigil, united in purpose, if not yet in spoken intention. Outside, snow continued to fall, transforming Pinewood Creek into a pristine landscape of possibility. Tomorrow would bring Christmas Day, with all its attendant joy and reflection. But tonight, in this moment of stillness, Elizabeth Morrison found herself exactly where she needed to be, not despite her journey's difficult beginning, but because of it. January brought with it a bitter cold that tested Pinewood Creek's resilience. Ice formed on the inside of windows, and the snow had hardened into treacherous paths throughout town. Yet within the clinic, warmth prevailed, not just from the constantly maintained stove, but from the evolving dynamics between its occupants. Hannah's recovery progressed steadily. By mid-January, she was attempting her first tentative steps with Thomas's support, her face a mixture of determination and apprehension that reminded Elizabeth of her own childhood struggles after illness had weakened her leg. "Small steps," Elizabeth encouraged from across the room, arms outstretched. "Look at me, not at your feet." Hannah bit her lip in concentration, her knuckles white where she gripped Thomas's offered hand. She managed 3 wobbly steps before her confidence faltered, but Thomas steadied her smoothly. "Excellent progress," he praised, his voice warm, with genuine approval. "Your strength is returning remarkably well." The Haywards had begun preparing for Hannah's return home, expected before month's end. This approaching transition hovered unspoken between Thomas and Elizabeth during their quiet evening conversations. The routine they had established, shared meals, collaborative work, the comfortable domesticity of caring for Hannah together, would soon end, forcing them to define their relationship outside the context that had nurtured its growth. Neither had referenced their interrupted Christmas Eve conversation. The demands of Hannah's care and Thomas's other patients had provided convenient diversion from personal matters. Yet Elizabeth caught Thomas watching her sometimes with an intensity that suggested unresolved thoughts, while she found herself increasingly aware of his presence in ways that extended beyond their professional partnership. On a particularly harsh Tuesday evening, with Hannah asleep and the clinic quiet, except for the occasional pop and hiss of the stove, Thomas finally broke their tacit agreement to postpone personal discussion. "Hannah will be returning home next week," he said, setting aside the medical journal he'd been reading. "The Haywards have prepared a bed for her downstairs, and her father has fashioned a walking aid similar to the one we've been using here." Elizabeth nodded, looking up from her mending. "She'll miss your company. You've become quite the storyteller these past weeks." Thomas smiled faintly. A skill developed by necessity rather than natural inclination. His expression grew more serious. "Her departure will change many things." "Yes," Elizabeth agreed, setting her sewing aside. "The clinic will seem remarkably quiet without her." "That's not what I meant." The directness of his response caught Elizabeth's attention. She met his gaze, recognizing that the conversation they had deferred could no longer be avoided. "Elizabeth," Thomas began, "these past weeks have revealed possibilities I had long since dismissed from my life. The shared care of Hannah, while professionally rewarding, has affected me in ways that transcend medical practice." Elizabeth felt her heart quicken. "Thomas, please," he interrupted gently, "allow me to finish while I have the courage." He rose, moving to stand near the stove, his back partially turned as if the words were easier to speak without direct eye contact. "Before you arrived in Pinewood Creek, I had reconciled myself to solitude. My injury," he flexed his damaged and unconsciously, "combined with the losses I experienced during the war, left me believing that certain aspects of life were no longer accessible to me." He turned to face her. "Your presence has challenged that assumption. Your strength, your resilience, your refusal to be defined by limitations imposed by others. These qualities have awakened something I thought permanently dormant." Elizabeth remained silent, understanding the significance of this carefully constructed declaration. "I find myself contemplating a future quite different from the one I had resigned myself to," Thomas continued. "However, I understand completely if your own plans don't accommodate such considerations. You came to Pinewood Creek seeking independence, not attachment." This final statement, so aligned with Elizabeth's own earlier concerns, now struck her as curiously misguided. The independence she had sought was freedom from dependency, not isolation from meaningful connection. "Thomas," she said finally, rising to stand before him, "independence doesn't preclude partnership, particularly when that partnership is founded on mutual respect rather than necessity or convenience." Hope flickered across his features. "Are you suggesting—" "I'm suggesting that your assumptions about my intentions may be as flawed as the town's assumptions about our capabilities." She smiled softly. "I came to Pinewood Creek seeking security and dignity. I found both, but I've also discovered something unexpected." "What is that?" Thomas asked, his voice barely audible. "A person who sees me completely, limitations, strengths and all, and values the whole rather than focusing on any single aspect." Elizabeth took a deep breath. "That kind of understanding is rare, perhaps even worth restructuring one's expectations around." The silence that followed held the weight of unspoken possibilities. Thomas moved slightly closer, close enough that Elizabeth could detect the faint scent of soap and medicinal herbs that always accompanied him. "Elizabeth," he said, her name almost a question in itself. "Are you certain? There would be challenges. Two people with physical limitations, public opinion, your teaching position. Those concerns seem remarkably insignificant compared to what we've already overcome independently," Elizabeth interrupted. "Imagine what might be possible together." Thomas reached for her hand, his touch tentative, as if still expecting rejection. "I have imagined it," he admitted quietly, "more frequently than I care to confess." Elizabeth's fingers curled around his, accepting the imperfect grip of his damaged hand without hesitation. "As have I." A sound from Hannah's room interrupted the moment. Not an emergency, merely the child turning in her sleep, but enough to remind them of their current responsibilities. They stepped apart slightly, though their hands remained joined. "We should discuss this more thoroughly," Thomas said, reluctance evident in his tone, "when our attention isn't divided by patient care." "Yes," Elizabeth agreed, "though I believe our actions these past weeks have spoken more clearly than any conversation might." Thomas's smile deepened. "Perhaps you're right. We've certainly demonstrated effective collaboration." "Among other things," Elizabeth replied, returning his smile. The week that followed carried the heightened awareness of acknowledged feelings. Though professional duties prevented any immediate resolution, Hannah's departure from the clinic, celebrated with a small gathering of family and clinic staff, marked the end of their shared domestic arrangement but confirmed the strength of their connection. Standing together as the Haywoods helped their daughter into the waiting wagon, Thomas's hand rested briefly at the small of Elizabeth's back, a simple gesture that conveyed volumes about his intentions. That evening, with Hannah gone and the clinic eerily quiet, Elizabeth prepared to return to her apartment above the milliner's shop. Her trunk stood packed, her presence in the clinic no longer justified by patient care. "It feels strange to leave," she admitted, as Thomas helped gather her few remaining items. "Almost as if you're leaving home," Thomas suggested quietly. The word hung between them, laden with meaning. Home, not a physical structure, but a state of belonging, of rightness. Elizabeth nodded. "Perhaps we should address that directly," Thomas said, setting down the book he'd been about to pack. "I've been considering a proposal. A professional, initially, though with personal implications." Elizabeth raised an eyebrow, suddenly reminded of their first real conversation when she had approached him with a proposition of clinic work. "The practice has grown significantly since you began assisting," Thomas explained. "Your organizational skills, your rapport with patients, your herbal knowledge, all have expanded what the clinic can offer. I'd like to formalize your position with appropriate compensation and title." "As your nurse?" Elizabeth asked, somewhat surprised by the professional nature of his proposal when personal matters seemed more pressing. "As my partner," Thomas clarified, "in the practice." The distinction was significant. "You're offering me a professional partnership?" "Yes," Thomas confirmed, but he hesitated, then continued with careful precision. "I hope it might eventually extend beyond professional boundaries, if agreeable to you." Elizabeth understood then, his methodical approach, addressing the practical foundation before building toward personal commitment. It was characteristic of his careful nature and strangely perfect for their situation. "I find both aspects of the proposal worthy of serious consideration," she replied, adopting his formal tone, though her eyes conveyed warmer sentiments. "The professional partnership would provide stability and purpose. The personal extension." "Bish," she smiled then, allowing her feelings to show clearly. "That would provide something equally essential." Thomas's expression softened with visible relief. There would be logistical matters to resolve. Your teaching position, living arrangements, inevitable town gossip. All manageable, Elizabeth asserted. The school term ends in May. I could complete my commitment while transitioning to full-time clinic work. She considered momentarily. As for living arrangements, propriety would suggest maintaining separate residences until more formal arrangements might be considered. The implication was clear, causing a flush of color across Thomas's cheekbones. Yes, of course. Though perhaps more convenient quarters could be secured. The rooms above the apothecary are larger than your current apartment and directly across from the clinic. Elizabeth smiled at his practical problem-solving. That would certainly simplify professional collaboration. Among other things, Thomas echoed her earlier phrase, a rare hint of humor in his expression. He moved closer then, his usual reserve, giving way to more urgent feelings. Elizabeth, I find I'm unwilling to postpone certain aspects of this discussion any longer. Which aspects? She asked, though she understood perfectly. In answer, Thomas reached for her hand, drawing her gently toward him. I would very much like to kiss you, he said quietly, if you're amenable. Elizabeth felt a rush of emotion, tenderness mixed with amusement at his formal request. I am entirely amenable, she assured him, tilting her face up to his. The kiss was tentative at first, both navigating unfamiliar territory. Then, like so many aspects of their relationship, it found its own natural rhythm, deepening into something that expressed everything words had tried and failed to capture. When they finally parted, Thomas kept her close, his forehead resting against hers. I had convinced myself such happiness wasn't meant for people like us, he admitted. People like us, Elizabeth repeated thoughtfully. Perhaps it's precisely because of who we are, what we've overcome, what we understand about struggle and resilience, that we can recognize true happiness when it presents itself. February brought wedding preparations alongside clinic work. The announcement of their engagement generated less surprise than either had anticipated, Martha Wilson claiming publicly that she'd seen it coming since November, while accepting congratulations for her matchmaking foresight. Harold Blackwood's reaction, witnessed during a chance encounter at the general store, provided Elizabeth with unexpected closure. His visible shock at seeing her not only recovered from his rejection, but thriving, engaged to the town's respected physician, her teaching position secure, her place in the community established, confirmed how thoroughly she had transcended his narrow judgment. Mr. Blackwood, she had acknowledged politely, before continuing her conversation with Martha, no longer defined by his dismissal nor seeking his approval. The wedding was scheduled for early June, after the school term ended, and spring had thoroughly established itself in Pinewood Creek. The clinic partnership began immediately. However, with Thomas installing a second desk beside his own and introducing Elizabeth formally to patients as Miss Morrison, my associate in this practice. Hannah Haywood's recovery progressed remarkably well, with only a slight unevenness in her gait that Thomas believed would diminish further as she grew. The child visited the clinic weekly, as much to share her school experiences with Elizabeth as for medical assessment. Will you still be my teacher after you marry Dr. Walker? She asked during one such visit. I'll complete this school year, Elizabeth explained, but afterward I'll be working full-time at the clinic. However, I'll always be available to help with your studies. Hannah considered this seriously. That seems fair. Besides, you'll be teaching other things, like how people can be different but still do important work. The simple wisdom startled Elizabeth with its clarity. Yes, she agreed softly. That's exactly what Dr. Walker and I hope to demonstrate. As winter gradually released its grip on Pinewood Creek, Elizabeth found herself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this point. The mail-order arrangement that had ended in humiliating rejection now seemed a necessary step toward an outcome she could never have anticipated. Had Harold Blackwood accepted her despite her disability, she would have become his wife, bound to a man who valued physical perfection over character, living a life constrained by his limited perception of her worth. Instead, his rejection had forced her to forge her own path, creating space for authentic connection with a man who recognized her complete humanity precisely because he understood how it felt to be reduced to a single limitation. Thomas found her lost in these thoughts one evening as they sat together in the clinic after hours, reviewing patient records. "You're miles away," he observed. "Reconsidering our arrangements?" Elizabeth smiled, reaching for his hand across the shared desk, a gesture that had become natural between them. "Quite the opposite. I was thinking how grateful I am for the path that led me here, difficult as it was at times." Thomas nodded, understanding without need for elaboration. The Chinese have a concept called kintsugi, the art of repairing broken pottery with gold, highlighting the breaks rather than disguising them. The result is considered more beautiful for having been broken. "I like that," Elizabeth said softly. "The idea that our fractures and repairs become part of our beauty rather than flaws to be hidden. It seems appropriate for us," Thomas agreed, his thumb tracing gentle patterns across her knuckles. Two imperfect people creating something stronger at the broken places. Outside, the first tentative signs of spring appeared as crocuses pushed through melting snow, evidence of life renewing itself after the harshest season. Within the clinic's warm interior, Elizabeth Morrison and Thomas Walker continued their evening work side by side, their futures now inextricably linked by choice rather than circumstance, their shared understanding transforming limitation into unexpected strength. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.